They were richer than Rockefeller, more influential than Carnegie, and at one point, more powerful than the US government itself. Yet somehow, most people have never even heard their name. The Mellons did not chase fame. They did not build monuments to themselves. They did not speak loudly, or publicly, or often. Instead, they moved in silence, quietly shaping America's economy, its industries, its tax laws, and even its presidential elections. While other families fought for attention, the Mellons fought for control. And they won. This is the story of a dynasty that rose from a poor Irish immigranto, a financial empire worth more than today's 5 richest Americans combined. An empire built not on charisma or spectacle, but on strategy, discretion, and an almost supernatural understanding of power. They dominated banking, oil, and aluminum. They engineered tax systems that protected their fortune for generations. They bought failing companies during national crises, then turned them into monopolies. And they learned how to use government offices not to serve the country, but to strengthen their own dynasty. Even now, whether you know their name or not, their influence still shapes your daily life. The taxes you pay, the industries you rely on, and the financial systems you move through every single day. Before we begin, now comment and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy calm, cinematic documentaries about hidden dynasties and unseen empires, subscribe to Money Vault so you never miss the next story the world forgot to tell. Now, let's begin the rise of the Mellon Dynasty. Chapter 1. Origins of a Dynasty, the Quiet Rise of Thomas Mellon. Long before the Mellon name whispered through the halls of power, before the banks, before the monopolies, before the political influence that would reshape an entire nation, there was a quiet valley in rural Ireland, and a boy who carried more ambition in his silence than most men carry in a lifetime. Thomas Mellon was born in 1813, in a landscape defined by hardship. The soil was thin, the winters unforgiving, and the prospects for most families painfully small. But Thomas saw the world differently from the beginning. He noticed patterns in the way people traded, saved, and struggled. He watched how opportunity rose and fell like the seasons. Predictable, cyclical, almost mathematical. And in those early observations, the first seeds of America's most hidden dynasty were planted. His family, like thousands of others, dreamed of something larger than survival. They dreamed of stability, of land that didn't betray them, of systems that rewarded hard work, of a world where a man could predict his own future instead of waiting for fate to decide it. And so, when Thomas was just a boy, the Mellons crossed the Atlantic, settling in the young, restless United States, a nation still learning who it wanted to become. A country in formation, and a mind built for it. America in the early 1800s was not the polished financial machine it would one day become. Its economy was unstable, its industries unformed, its laws inconsistent. Almost immigrants. This instability looked frightening, but to Thomas Mellon, it looked familiar. The unpredictability reminded him of Ireland's unforgiving cycles. Only here, volatility wasn't a death sentence. It was a ladder. Where others saw chaos, he saw structure waiting to be built. Where others sought stability, he sought leverage. And while most families tried to blend quietly into American life, Thomas began studying it, paying attention not to opportunities that already existed, but to the cracks where new opportunities would soon form. He observed the wealthy families of Pittsburgh, the merchants, the landowners, the financiers. He realized something striking. Power did not belong to the loudest man in the room. It belonged to the man who understood how money moved when no one else was watching. The first calculated step. Thomas Mellon did not rush toward wealth. He moved deliberately, almost cautiously, as if he understood that true fortunes are not built in sudden leaps, but in quiet accumulation. He worked as a clerk. He studied law. He read obsessively about banking, land speculation, and the patterns of American expansion. He watched the newly industrializing city of Pittsburgh transform from a smoky outpost into a rising steel capital. And he realized that those who controlled the flow of capital into these industries would one day control the industries themselves. Every choice he made in these early years had a single purpose: to place himself in the small, quiet circle of men who understood America's financial future before America did. By the time he opened his own law practice in Pittsburgh, Thomas Mellon had already developed the philosophy that would guide his family for more than a century. Invest not in what exists, but in what the country will need before it knows it needs it. A mind built for banking. As Thomas observed the new industrial world emerging around him, he noticed something few others did. Factories were useless without capital. Railroads were impossible without credit. Land meant nothing without loans to develop it. And every crisis, every downturn, every panic shifted wealth from the unprepared to the patient. Banking, he realized, was not merely a profession. It was the quiet mechanism of empire. And so, long before the Rockefellers built their oil monopoly, long before Carnegie forged his steel empire, Thomas Mellon prepared the foundation for something even more enduring. A dynasty built not on one industry, but on the financial machinery that powered all of them. The philosophy that would define a dynasty. Thomas Mellon moved through life with a calm intelligence that bordered on coldness. He rarely advertised his intentions. He avoided unnecessary attention. He preferred silence to spectacle. And he believed that the most powerful families were the ones the world never bothered to notice. This philosophy, secrecy over fame, strategy over aggression, patience over noise, would shape every generation that followed. The Mellons would become bankers, industrialists, financiers, statesmen, but always quietly, always in the background, always constructing influence where the public could not see it. Their rise did not begin with wealth. It began with perspective, with a young immigrant who recognized that America was a puzzle, and that the man who learned its pieces early would own the game long after others stopped playing. And slowly, piece by piece, Thomas Mellon began assembling the quiet architecture of what would become America's most powerful dynasty. You've never heard of. Thomas Mellon entered adulthood during a period when America was beginning to stretch its ambitions across the continent. Cities expanded outward, railroads carved through forests and mountains, factories multiplied, and fortunes rose quickly, only to collapse in the blink of an eye. To most Americans, this volatility was terrifying, but to Thomas, it looked like opportunity wrapped in noise. That he learned early that America did not reward the boldest voice. It rewarded the man who understood timing, the man who watched carefully while others rushed, the man who made decisions only after everyone else had exhausted themselves. Thomas observed the industrial elite with an almost clinical calm. He watched merchants build wealth through risky speculation, then lose everything during sudden downturns. He watched lawyers chase quick profits, only to be swallowed by debt when cases dried up. He watched landowners expand too aggressively, only to watch their assets shrink during national panics. And with each observation, he sharpened a philosophy that would define his dynasty. Real fortune belongs to the man who prepares during calm and moves during crisis. While others hunted for shortcuts, Thomas built structure. While others gambled on timing, Thomas built patience. While others talked endlessly about opportunity, Thomas moved quietly toward the mechanisms that produced opportunity. Every career step, from clerk to lawyer to judge, was intentional, a slow migration toward the world that controlled all others. Financed out a judge who did not love the law. When Thomas Mellon became a judge, the public saw a man rising in social status, but they misunderstood him. That he did not love the courtroom, that he did not love the spectacle, he did not love the ceremony of law, that he loved what the position revealed. That it exposed who owed money, who defaulted, which families struggled, which businesses expanded too quickly, which landowners were on the brink of collapse. From the judge's bench, Thomas saw something far more valuable than legal disputes. He saw patterns of failure, and through those patterns, he learned how to predict success. He understood which industries would expand next. That he recognized which businesses were quietly drowning. He understood how wealth moved beneath the surface of a city that looked chaotic on the outside. The courtroom was not a place of justice to him. It was a classroom. A quiet, steady education in American capitalism. Why Thomas Mellon left public life after a decade as a judge? Thomas did something unusual. He walked away. Not because he failed, not because he lacked influence, but because he knew something few others understood. Public roles create visibility. Visibility creates vulnerability. If he wanted to build something enduring, something powerful, something capable of influencing the very shape of American capitalism, he needed to disappear from public sight. Quietly, without ceremony, Thomas stepped back from his judicial position and re-entered private life, not as a lawyer, but as a strategist preparing the foundation of a dynasty that he liquidated assets. He studied the failures of his peers that he examined the early banking systems forming around Pittsburgh, and he realized the moment he had waited for his entire life had finally arrived. America needed banks, reliable banks, conservative banks, banks run not by gamblers or dreamers, but by someone who understood how to build wealth through stability, not risk. The country was expanding faster than its financial system could handle. Industries were rising without capital structures to support them, and economic panic, struck America every few years. Like a storm, Thomas saw what others could not. In a country addicted to volatility, the man who offered stability would become indispensable. And so, at a moment when few believed banking was a noble or profitable profession, Thomas Mellon began to shape the institution that would one day control the financial arteries of American industry. The dynasty had not yet begun, but the blueprint was forming, quietly, precisely, inevitably. By the time Thomas Mellon reached middle age, the United States had entered a period of transformation so rapid that most people struggled simply to keep pace. New industries rose out of smoke and steel. New cities formed around rivers, mills, and rail lines. New fortunes appeared almost overnight and vanished just as quickly. But Thomas was never interested in quick fortunes. He wanted something sturdier, something predictable, something that could survive the storms of American capitalism rather than being swept into them. He had spent decades studying the patterns behind success and failure. He watched the feverish rise of entrepreneurs who believed brilliance alone could overpower risk. He studied the quiet ruin of families who staked their futures. On one good year, he observed the new millionaires who mistook momentum for immortality. And from all of these observations, he drew a conclusion that felt almost old world in its wisdom. Wealth built in chaos will die in chaos. Wealth built in silence endures. The first loan that changed everything before founding an empire, Thomas made a small, almost unremarkable decision. He began lending money privately, not through a storefront, not through advertisements, not through public banking channels. He lent discreetly, cautiously, to people he had studied, industries he understood, and opportunities whose outcomes he could almost predict in advance. He lent when the moment was quiet, not when the city buzzed with optimism, but when fear made the bold retreat. This was where Thomas Mellon revealed his true genius. He lent when others hoarded, and he collected when others collapsed. As Pittsburgh industrialists struggled through downturns, Thomas quietly acquired land at fractions of its true value. When factories needed capital to stay alive, he structured loans that gave him long-term stakes in their futures. When railroads faltered, he purchased securities that would become priceless once the economy recovered. Each small decision created a thread, and slowly, those threads began to weave the fabric of a dynasty. A bank built like a fortress in 1869. Thomas Mellon founded the institution that would one day become one of the most influential financial engines in American history, Mellon Bank. But this was not a bank built for spectacle. It was not meant to be seen as a bold new entry into American finance. It was designed as a fortress, a place where capital remained safe when the country trembled. Its principles were simple: avoid speculation, avoid glamour, lend conservatively, but strategically. Never extend yourself beyond stability. Understand the borrower better than he understands himself. Where other banks chased industrial booms, Mellon Bank prepared for industrial collapse. Where others expanded aggressively, Thomas expanded quietly. Where others sought wealth, Thomas sought resilience. And because the world rewards the calmest man in the room during panic, Mellon Bank grew stronger each time America fell into crisis. It did not take long for industrialists to understand the truth. If you wanted to survive a downturn, you needed Thomas Mellon. A dynasty begins to form. Thomas Mellon had three great insights that would shape the future of his family. 1. Banking creates leverage over every industry: steel, oil, railroads, manufacturing. All of them depended on capital. Control the capital, and you control the country. Point 2. Crises are not threats. They are opportunities. Economic panic shifts wealth from the unprepared to the patient. Thomas constructed his empire around this principle. Point 3. Visibility is the enemy of endurance. He never sought fame. He never courted the press. He never allowed his family's name to overshadow their quiet influence. This philosophy became the Mellon's inheritance, a blueprint handed down to sons and grandsons who would one day expand this modest bank into a financial empire that dominated American industry from the shadows. Thomas did not live to see the full magnitude of what he created, but he sensed it. He felt the quiet momentum building behind his decisions. He recognized that his family had stepped onto a path with no real rivals, a path that led not to wealth alone, but to power so subtle, so deeply embedded in the nation's economy, that future generations would influence America without ever needing to raise their voices. By the time Thomas Mellon stepped back from daily work, the dynasty was already forming, not loudly, not publicly, but patiently. In the quiet rhythm of interest payments, in the slow accumulation of land, in the discreet ownership stakes in factories and railroads, in the calm decisions made while others panicked. The foundation was complete, the torch was ready to pass, and the descendants of this quiet Irish immigrant were about to transform themselves from careful bankers into architects of America's financial future. Chapter 2. From Stability to Strategy: How the Mellon sons turned a bank into an empire. When Thomas Mellon stepped back from daily work, he left behind more than a bank. He left behind a philosophy, a way of thinking about power, money, and survival that would define his descendants for over a century. His sons, Andrew Mellon and Richard Mellon, inherited not just their father's wealth, but his quiet discipline, his patience, and his unwavering belief that the greatest opportunities appear when the world is falling apart. And in the decades ahead, America would break open in ways that would test every institution in the country, except the Mellons. Because while most families feared instability, the Mellon brothers were built for it. A new industrial America needs a new kind of banker. By the late 1800s, the United States was no longer a young, uncertain nation. Railroads stretched across plains, steel mills roared in Pittsburgh, and factories filled cities with new workers and new wealth. This was the birth of industrial America, a chaotic, booming era full of possibility and danger. Most banks were terrified. How do you lend money to an economy that could double one year and collapse the next? How do you manage risk in a world where entire industries were being invented from thin air? Andrew Mellon understood something the other bankers did not. The future belongs to those who finance it. Instead of avoiding risk, he studied it. Instead of fearing new industries, he dissected them, their weaknesses, their cycles, their potential for domination. And he realized something extraordinary. No industry could grow without capital, but every industry needed different capital. Steel needed long-term credit. Oil needed fast liquidity. Manufacturing needed steady financing. Railroads needed massive injections of money just to survive early losses. Andrew didn't just lend to these industries. He tailored the entire Mellon financial system around them. This was the first step in transforming a conservative bank into the financial engine of American industrialization. The brothers' division of power. Thomas Mellon's two sons were nothing alike, and that is exactly why the dynasty flourished. Andrew Mellon, the brilliant strategist, moved with careful precision through the world of finance. He had a talent for reading people, sensing weakness, and understanding opportunity almost instinctively. He preferred quiet rooms, long calculations, and slow decisions. His power was cold, calm, and deeply analytical. Richard Mellon, on the other hand, was a stabilizer, a protector, a man whose calm personality ensured the family's holdings never outgrew their foundation. He expanded real estate holdings, strengthened the bank's balance sheets, and reinforced the empire's internal structure. If Andrew was the blade, Richard was the handle. Together, they created a dynasty that was simultaneously aggressive and controlled, a rare balance in American business. The first great acquisition, oil. At a time when most bankers avoided the oil industry due to its volatility, Andrew Mellon saw something others missed. Oil was not just fuel. It was the foundation of the future. Cars, factories, railroads, ships, electricity. All of them needed oil. Andrew quietly backed early oil companies, including the one that would become Gulf Oil, one of the most powerful energy companies in American history. He financed them through downturns. He bought stakes when prices crashed, He structured deals that secured long-term control without public attention. When other financiers panicked in the early oil crashes, Andrew simply waited and collected entire companies at fractions of their value. This was the Mellon way: profit by patience, control through quiet leverage. The brother who built cities while Andrew built the empire's external influence. Richard Mellon strengthened its internal foundations. He acquired land, not in small parcels, but in city-shaping quantities, entire neighborhoods, industrial zones, railway corridors, strategic real estate that would multiply in value as Pittsburgh grew into a major American city. He did not buy aggressively, he bought deliberately, always with the thought, how will this land generate power in the future? Richard's talent ensured that no matter how volatile the financial markets became, the Mellon family holdings would remain grounded in tangible, stable assets, the dynasty preparing for its defining moment. By the turn of the century, the Mellons had done something astonishing. They had built a financial empire without headlines. They had acquired energy holdings without attracting attention. They had purchased real estate quietly, patiently, strategically, and they had positioned themselves at the center of American industry, while the world remained focused on the more flamboyant fortunes of Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. But the moment that would transform the Mellons from wealthy bankers into the most powerful dynasty in the United States was just beginning to approach. That a moment of national panic, that a moment of economic collapse, that a moment where America would cry out for stability. And the Mellons would be the only ones prepared to answer. The United States was heading toward crisis, and the Mellon family, shaped by patience and guided by quiet strategy, was about to become the unofficial financial backbone of the entire nation. As the United States entered the early 1900s, the country fell into a familiar rhythm: boom, then collapse, optimism, then fear, growth, then panic. Factories expanded too quickly, railroads accumulated unsustainable debts, banks overextended themselves, and ordinary Americans, whose lives rose and fell with the industrial tides, felt the consequences of a system that grew faster than it could stabilize. Economic downturns became a defining feature of American life. Yet, while fear gripped industrialists and bankers across the country, the Mellons remained calm, because crisis was not a threat to them. Crisis was their blueprint. Why crisis created Mellon power? Andrew Mellon had studied every major financial panic of the 1800s. He understood the difference between temporary collapse and permanent failure. He knew which companies were doomed and which merely needed capital to survive the storm. So when America panicked, Andrew moved quietly, strategically, without hesitation. He bought controlling stakes in industries when their prices hit the floor. He extended credit to companies that had promising futures but weak balance sheets. He acquired factories, mines, mills, and refineries at a fraction of their value. And most importantly, he positioned the Mellon family as the only group willing and able to stabilize entire sectors of the economy. While thousands of businesses collapsed, Andrew built an empire. His philosophy was simple: buy when the country holds its breath. The rise of aluminum, a gamble no one else would take at the time. Aluminum was considered a rare, almost useless metal. It was expensive to produce and had limited commercial value. Most industrialists ignored it entirely, but Andrew Mellon sensed something that others couldn't yet see. Aluminum was light. It was strong. It was scalable. And the industries of the future, aviation, automobiles, construction, would depend on it. So he quietly financed a struggling startup called Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of America. While others dismissed the metal as a scientific curiosity, Andrew funded research, machinery, new smelting techniques, and expansions into new markets. Once again, his patience became prophetic. As airplanes, automobiles, and modern architecture exploded across America, Alcoa became the only company capable of supplying the aluminum the industrial world suddenly demanded. The Mellons didn't just invest in aluminum, they owned it. And through Alcoa, they controlled one of the most important materials of the 20th century. One by one, American industries became dependent on Mellon capital. A family that understood leverage without visibility. The major industrial dynasties of the era, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, built fame as aggressively as they built fortunes. They appeared in newspapers. They were targets of political debate. They were loved, hated, admired. criticized, feared, but the Mellons remained invisible in interviews, in extravagant mansions in the spotlight, in public declarations of power. Their silence was not shyness, it was strategy, because Andrew understood something the other dynasties did not. The wealth that is seen can be attacked. The wealth that is unseen becomes untouchable. This invisibility allowed the Mellons to operate where other billionaires could not, inside the machinery of the American government. And when the next crisis hit, the Mellon family wouldn't just profit quietly. They would rewrite the rules of the U.S. economy itself. Positioning for political power by 1920, America was entering a new phase. A phase where economic policy mattered just as much as industrial strength. Tax law, regulation, monetary policy, business incentives, corporate consolidation. These were no longer abstract concepts. They were tools that could protect wealth or destroy it. Andrew Mellon knew that if he wanted to preserve the dynasty for generations, he needed to guide those tools, not from the outside, not through lobbying, but from the inside. And so, after decades of operating in quiet financial shadows, Andrew stepped into public life, not as a businessman seeking influence, but as a statesman who would shape America's financial system more profoundly than any person in U.S. history. The stage was set, the moment was approaching, and the Mellons were prepared to go from hidden financiers to the architects of the American economy. By the early 1920s, Andrew Mellon stood at a crossroads. His family already controlled vast portions of American industry: banking, oil, aluminum, coal, real estate, manufacturing. His influence stretched quietly through boardrooms and balance sheets, across companies that powered the country's growth. But Andrew understood something essential. Financial empires can rise in private, but to endure, they must be protected in public. And so, after a lifetime of avoiding attention, after decades spent building fortunes in silence, Andrew Mellon accepted a position that would place him in the center of American power. Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. It was a role he did not seek publicly, a role he accepted reluctantly, but a role he knew he needed, because for the first time in American history, a man who controlled the country's industrial capital would also control the country's national capital. A banker in the nation's highest financial office. When Andrew Mellon stepped into the Treasury in 1921, the United States was emerging from war, recession, and deep financial instability. Government debt was soaring. Taxes were crushing both individuals and businesses. The economy lacked direction. Most policymakers, the problem looked overwhelming. Andrew Mellon, it looked familiar. He had spent his entire career stabilizing chaotic industries, rescuing distressed companies, and building long-term financial structures where others saw collapse. Now, he would apply the Mellon philosophy not to a company, but to an entire country, and he would do it calmly, quietly, and with almost surgical precision. The Mellon tax system, a blueprint for dynastic wealth. Once in office, Andrew began redesigning the U.S. tax code, slowly, carefully. Invisibly, he argued that high taxes discouraged investment. He insisted that reducing tax rates would stimulate economic growth. He framed his reforms as patriotic, a way to unleash American industry. But beneath the rhetoric, one purpose guided every change: protect private fortunes, especially his own. Mellon reduced taxes for wealthy individuals. He cut corporate taxes by historic margins. He removed obstacles to mergers and consolidations. He weakened inheritance taxes that threatened old money families. He created loopholes that funneled wealth through trusts and foundations. These were not minor adjustments. They were structural changes that would endure long after he left office. Changes that still exist in the American tax system today. It was the most elegant act of self-preservation in U.S. financial history. Andrew Mellon had done something extraordinary. He engineered a tax system that rewarded the very methods he used to build his dynasty. The quiet architect of American prosperity during the 1920s, the nation entered what is now called the Roaring Twenties, a decade of explosive growth. The economy surged, businesses flourished, workers earned more, corporations expanded across the country, and much of that prosperity, the stability, the confidence, the direction, came from Andrew Mellon's stewardship. He became known, quietly and without fanfare, as the greatest Treasury Secretary since Alexander Hamilton. But unlike Hamilton, Mellon did not seek to build a nation for its own sake. He sought to build a nation that would protect the Mellon Dynasty forever, the most powerful man in America. Without the world realizing it by the mid-1920s, Andrew Mellon held more power than any banker, any politician, or any industrialist in America. That he controlled the treasury, that he controlled the tax code, he controlled capital flows, he controlled the industries that shaped the economy, and he controlled the financial mechanisms behind mergers, acquisitions, and corporate expansions. He was the invisible conductor of American capitalism, guiding decisions that shaped millions of lives, while remaining almost entirely unknown to the general public. Rockefeller built Standard Oil, Carnegie built steel, Ford built cars. But Mellon? Mellon built the financial system that built everything else. The storm approaches, yet even as the economy soared, Andrew Mellon sensed a growing tension beneath the surface, a fragility in the markets, an unsustainable euphoria, a disconnect between production and speculation. That he recognized the signs from decades of study. Another collapse was coming, a collapse far larger than any before. And when it arrived, the Mellon Dynasty would once again be positioned not to fall, but to rise higher. Because crisis was their inheritance, their language, their advantage. And the greatest crisis in American history was now approaching on the horizon. Chapter 3. The calm before the fall. The Mellons and America on the edge of collapse. As the 1920s drew to a close, the United States shimmered with optimism. Factories ran day and night. Cities expanded upward into steel and glass. Ordinary Americans bought stocks on borrowed money, convinced the boom would last forever. But beneath the brightness, cracks had begun to form. Production outpaced demand. Credit expanded beyond reason. Banks lent money to people who could not repay it. Stock prices rose faster than the profits behind them. To most of the country, these warning signs were invisible. But Andrew Mellon had seen this pattern before. He had spent a lifetime studying moments when confidence became illusion. And now, for the first time in his Treasury career, he felt the familiar weight of a coming storm. Quietly, without public alarm, he began preparing, not for disaster itself, but for how the Mellon Dynasty would endure it. The market grows louder throughout 1928 and 1929. The stock market no longer behaved like a reflection of economic growth. It behaved like a fever. Prices climbed simply because people expected them to climb. New investors flooded the market with borrowed money. Corporations bought their own shares to keep prices rising. Banks encouraged customers to take on more debt, promising endless returns. The entire system was built on momentum, not stability. And Andrew Mellon knew momentum was the most fragile force in finance. That he spoke cautiously in private meetings, urging restraint. But few listened. The country was intoxicated by prosperity. People trusted the illusion more than the quiet warnings of the man who understood the economy better than anyone alive. Mellon prepares the dynasty while the public celebrated. Mellon repositioned key holdings. That he strengthened the liquidity of Mellon Banked. He diversified assets across industries that could survive contraction. He protected stakes in Gulf Oil and Alcoa, knowing essential resources would outlast speculative markets. He did not panic. He did not sell in desperation. That he did not hide from the coming downturn. That he simply prepared. This was the Mellon philosophy in its purest form. Prosperity was temporary. Control was permanent. The collapse in October 1929, the markets finally broke. Prices plunged. Investors scrambled to sell. Banks failed as depositors demanded cash that no longer existed. Factories laid off workers. The optimism of the roaring 20s evaporated in a matter of days. The Great Depression had begun. People looked to Washington for direction, and the man they looked to most was Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. Yet Mellon did not react with fear. He had survived panics before. He understood that crises were not only destructive, they were restructuring events. They cleared out excess. They reshaped industries. They created opportunities that would define the future. The question was not whether the Mellon Dynasty would survive the Great Depression. The question was how much stronger they would become because of it. America begins to fracture as unemployment spread and banks collapsed. Frustration grew toward financial elites. People demanded answers. They wanted someone to blame. Rockefeller was criticized. Big banks were attacked in newspapers. Corporations were accused of greed, but the Mellon family, quiet, private, nearly invisible, remained outside the public spotlight. Their invisibility once again protected them. The country did not fully realize how deeply Mellon strategies had shaped the economic system. Or how much power Andrew still held behind the scenes. The nation was entering its darkest economic chapter, and the Mellons were stepping into the most defining moment of their dynasty. Because while the country struggled to survive, the Mellon family was preparing to reshape American capitalism once again. The Great Depression did not unfold in a single moment. It spread slowly, like a shadow moving across the country. Banks failed one after another. Factories went silent. Families lost their homes. Entire towns collapsed under the weight of unemployment. But inside Mellon offices and boardrooms, the mood was different. There was no panic, no frantic selling, no desperate attempts to escape the collapse. The Mellons had built their philosophy around moments like this. They understood that crisis was not chaos. It was a cycle, and cycles could be navigated with patience. Andrew Mellon's controversial strategy as Secretary of the Treasury. Andrew Mellon offered guidance that later became one of the most debated recommendations in American economic history. He believed downturns should be allowed to run their natural course. In his view, failures cleared the system of excess. Inefficient companies would fall. Stronger companies would survive. Wealth would shift toward those prepared for adversity. It was a harsh philosophy, but it was the same strategy the Mellon family had used for decades to build their empire. Ordinary Americans. The idea felt cold. Mellon. It felt logical. The same pattern that built Mellon Bank, that built Gulf Oil, that built Alcoa, was now being applied to the entire nation. Quiet repositioning behind the scenes even while he served as Treasury Secretary. Andrew Mellon continued observing the financial world with the same careful eye he used as a private banker. He noticed which companies had overextended themselves. He saw which banks were fundamentally unstable. He recognized which industries would emerge stronger once the downturn passed. And quietly, through intermediaries and trusted partners, Mellon influence moved through the economy. They bought distressed assets at deep discounts. They acquired land from bankrupt owners. They increased stakes in companies that still had long-term potential. They strengthened holdings that would dominate the post-crisis world. Every move was slow. Every move was deliberate. Every move followed the same rule. Buy when others are afraid to look. Public vulnerability and private resilience. As Mellon became a target of political frustration, people accused him of protecting the wealthy. They accused him of shaping tax laws for the benefit of elites. They accused him of allowing banks and businesses to collapse without intervention. But none of these accusations weakened his family's position. In fact, the public anger created a distraction that allowed the Mellons to operate with even less visibility. While the spotlight turned toward Congress, the Mellon empire grew quietly stronger. They consolidated control over essential industries. They expanded their financial reach into regions untouched by previous investments. They gained influence in areas of the economy that other industrial families had neglected. The Mellons did not merely survive the Depression, they realigned their empire around it. A shift in control eventually. Political pressure forced Andrew Mellon out of the Treasury, but this did not weaken the dynasty. It freed it. Andrew no longer needed to navigate public scrutiny. He returned to private life, where he could operate without the limits of office. He still held vast influence over banking networks. He still controlled immense industrial holdings. He still shaped decisions through personal connections and strategic alliances. Stepping down from political office did not reduce his power. It removed the visibility that threatened it. The hidden rise during national collapse. By the early 1930s, something extraordinary had happened. While America lost nearly everything, the Mellon Empire gained the one thing it valued most: position. They owned more hard assets. They controlled more industries. They had deeper influence across corporate America. They had cash reserves when almost no one else did. They had leverage that would last for decades. And the country, focused on its own suffering, had no idea. The Mellons had not exploited the crisis. They had prepared for it. And now, as the nation struggled to rebuild itself, the dynasty stood ready for the next phase of American capitalism. The Great Depression had tested the country. It had reshaped industries. It had humiliated empires. But it had only confirmed the Mellon principle. Crisis destroys the unprepared and elevates those who understand its rhythm. As the Great Depression deepened, the United States entered a period of uncertainty unlike anything it had ever faced. Millions were unemployed. Banks collapsed every week. Factories stood silent for months at a time. Families waited in food lines that stretched across entire city blocks. But inside Mellon headquarters, the atmosphere remained controlled and steady. Not because the family was untouched by the crisis, but because they had built their empire on principles designed to withstand it. The Mellons knew that cycles break societies, but they also rebuild them. And in times of economic collapse, those who remain disciplined become the architects of what comes next. At a nation searching for stability, the United States began to turn toward the government for answers. President Franklin Roosevelt launched sweeping programs to relieve suffering and restore confidence. Banks were restructured. New agencies were created. Industries were regulated in ways the country had never seen before. One by one, old financial structures crumbled, but Mellon institutions remained solid. Mellon Bank had conservative lending practices. Gulf Oil had essential products the nation depended on. Alcoa sat at the center of industries that would grow stronger with government-backed infrastructure projects. The family's empire was not built on speculation. It was built on industries that America could not function without. While other fortunes were erased, the Mellon fortune endured, quiet influence behind the new deal. Andrew Mellon was no longer in public office, but that did not mean he lost influence. Many of the policymakers in Washington had known him for years. Some owed their careers to him. Others respected his understanding of finance even if they disagreed with his views. Through private conversations, letters, and intermediaries, Mellon perspectives still shaped decisions. Which industries received support? How capital was allocated? Which corporations were allowed to survive? Which mergers were quietly approved? Even in retirement, Andrew understood the central rule of power. You do not need a title to influence a system. You need access to the people who run it. And that access was something the Mellon Dynasty had cultivated for decades. The rise of Mellon philanthropy. As the Depression dragged on, the family began something that would redefine their public legacy. They donated land for public parks. They funded museums, universities, and research institutions. They built cultural landmarks that still define American cities today. This philanthropy served multiple purposes. It softened their public image. It preserved wealth through charitable foundations. And it ensured that the Mellon name would be woven into the physical and cultural landscape of the country. Art galleries, botanical gardens, endowments, libraries. These were not vanity projects. They were long-term investments in influence. A family that controlled the economy now began shaping the country's culture. The empire recalibrates. By the mid-1930s, Mellon Enterprises had shifted into a new phase. Gulf Oil expanded globally as nations sought reliable fuel sources. Alcoa became essential to aviation, construction, and military manufacturing. Mellon Bank grew by absorbing smaller institutions weakened by the crisis. Real estate holdings appreciated as cities rebuilt and expanded. The dynasty was no longer simply surviving the Great Depression. It was positioning itself to dominate the post-war economy that was soon approaching. Andrew Mellon, older now, watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. His methods had been criticized. His philosophy had been debated. His decisions had shaped the lives of millions. But the results were undeniable. The Mellon dynasty stood stronger after the Depression than before it. A quiet passing of the torch. As Andrew Mellon's health declined, the family prepared for transition. His children and relatives stepped deeper into leadership roles. New hands began guiding old institutions. The next generation inherited not just companies, but a system of thinking: patience over aggression, silence over visibility, strategy over emotion, endurance above all. When Andrew Mellon died in 1937, the country remembered him as a former Treasury Secretary, but insiders knew the truth. He had been one of the most powerful financial figures in American history. The architect of tax policy, the stabilizer of industries, the quiet engine behind an empire few fully understood. The Great Depression had ended careers, destroyed fortunes, and rewritten the country's destiny. But for the Mellon family, it had done something else. It had proven that their dynasty was built not on wealth alone, but on a philosophy strong enough to survive any economic storm. Chapter 4. A Post-War World. How the Mellons quietly positioned themselves for America's next boom. When World War II ended, the United States emerged into a new economic era. Factories shifted from wartime production to consumer goods. Millions of soldiers returned home searching for stability. Highways expanded, suburbs grew. New industries formed almost overnight. America was rebuilding itself with confidence, speed, and an optimism it had not felt in decades. And once again, the Mellon Dynasty was perfectly positioned for the moment, not because they predicted the war, not because they influenced political outcomes, but because they had built their empire around industries the country would always need, regardless of the shape of the future. The new American landscape, the end of the war, marked the beginning of a golden age for American industry. Construction surged as cities expanded outward. Energy demand skyrocketed as factories roared back to life. Banks became central to homeownership, business expansion, and infrastructure projects. Air travel, once experimental, began transforming into a commercial necessity. The Mellons held major stakes in every one of these areas. Gulf oil powered transportation and industrial growth. Alcoa supplied the aluminum needed for aircraft, automobiles, and architecture. Mellon Bank financed construction, corporate expansion, and consumer credit. Their real estate holdings grew in value as cities modernized. This alignment was not luck. It was the result of a philosophy passed down through generations. Build in silence. Invest in fundamentals. Prepare for the world that will exist 10 years from now, not the world today. The Mellon way of adapting. Other industrial families struggled to adjust to the post-war world. Many had built their fortunes on wartime demand. When peace arrived, their businesses shrank. Some collapsed entirely, but the Mellons did not rely on temporary booms. They invested in essential systems. Power, transportation, infrastructure, metals, and finance were not trends. They were permanent pillars of the American economy. This allowed the Mellon family to transition smoothly into the new era, expanding their influence without attracting attention and without the volatility that plagued other industrial empires. The new generation steps forward with Andrew Mellon gone. Leadership shifted to the next members of the dynasty. They were quieter than the industrial giants of their time. They did not seek publicity. They did not cultivate celebrity. They did not compete with the new wave of post-war billionaires for recognition. Instead, they carried forward the same disciplined mindset that had defined the family since Thomas Mellon's earliest days. Move cautiously, observe patiently, act selectively, endure everything. Their focus was not on building splashy new enterprises. It was on strengthening the foundations already in place. While other families pursued rapid growth, the Mellons pursued stability. They understood that the world was entering a period of long-term expansion, one that would reward those who controlled the quiet, essential systems beneath the surface of American life. The transformation of Gulf oil and Alcoa. During this era, Gulf oil expanded into dozens of countries, securing drilling rights and refining operations that extended Mellon influence far beyond U.S. borders. Alcoa became a global force in metals manufacturing, providing aluminum for aircraft, automobiles, packaging, and construction across the world. These were not companies reacting to the post-war boom. They were companies prepared for it, decades in advance. Each success confirmed the Mellon philosophy. The future belongs to those who position themselves before the world realizes what it needs. America grows louder. The Mellons grow quieter. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the United States entered a period of cultural transformation. Television reshaped entertainment. Corporations embraced marketing. Celebrities influenced public opinion. Wealth became something to display, not hide. But the Mellons never followed that path. Their power had always been silent. Their influence remained behind the scenes. Their strategy focused on enduring institutions, not public narratives. They were the opposite of the modern billionaire, invisible, careful, and deeply rooted in the financial architecture of the country. And in a world that rewarded spectacle, their silence ensured their survival. The Mellon Dynasty was entering a new chapter, one where wealth alone was not enough. Influence required adaptation, and the family would soon learn how to navigate a nation where politics, culture, and economics were shifting simultaneously. The world was changing, but the Mellons, as always, were prepared. As the United States entered the 1960s and 1970s, a new form of power began shaping the country. It was no longer defined solely by factories, railroads, or oil fields. Influence now lived in policy, philanthropy, and the ability to shape public institutions from behind the scenes. Public figures became louder, corporations became more recognizable, foundations and charities took on new cultural importance. And while many wealthy families embraced this new public-facing world, the Mellons chose a different path. They refined their invisibility. They built institutions that lasted longer than companies. They strengthened influence through education, culture, and quiet financial networks. This period did not make them richer in the traditional sense that it made them foundational. Quiet expansion through culture. One of the most subtle and effective strategies of the Mellon Dynasty was its shift into cultural institutions. They funded museums, endowments, art conservation projects, botanical gardens, and scientific research centers. These contributions preserved wealth, protected assets, and embedded the Mellon name in the intellectual fabric of the nation. This was not philanthropy for publicity. It was influence through permanence. That a corporation can be bought or sold. That a museum endowment lasts for generations. That a research institution shapes entire fields of study. That a library reshapes the identity of a city. These projects offered something the financial markets never could: stability. And stability was the Mellon family's language, strengthening the financial core while cultural projects grew quietly. The Mellon financial empire expanded its reach even further. Mellon Bank became one of the safest and most respected financial institutions in the country. It attracted corporations, governments, and wealthy individuals who sought conservative management over speculative growth. Its balance sheet grew slowly but consistently, reflecting Thomas Mellon's original principles. By the late 20th century, Mellon Bank was no longer just a regional financial institution. It was a national anchor. Its reputation rested not on innovation or risk, but on reliability, predictability, patience, the same traits that defined the dynasty itself. Gulf oil becomes global during this era. Gulf oil reached one of its highest levels of influence. It secured drilling rights in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. It expanded refining and distribution networks. It became a global brand associated with trust, energy, and modern infrastructure. Even though the world knew the name Gulf, it did not know the family behind it. This was the Mellons' preferred way of operating. Visibility for the company, invisibility for the dynasty. Alcoa shapes the modern world at the same time. Alcoa grew into one of the most important industrial companies of its era. Its aluminum-shaped airplanes, skyscrapers, electrical grids, and national defense industries. Its products became so essential that the company's performance was often considered a proxy for overall industrial strength. The Mellons did not need to manage these companies openly. Their influence flowed through board positions, stock ownership, and long-standing leadership traditions built on conservative decision-making. They controlled the rhythm of industries without controlling the spotlight, preparing for a transformed America as cultural norms evolved and technologies emerged. The Mellon family recognized a subtle shift in American life. Influence was no longer measured only in assets. It was measured in information, access, networks, institutions that shaped the country's intellectual and political ecosystem. And so they adapted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet intention that defined their rise. They strengthened their private foundations. They deepened academic ties. They ensured that Mellon-endowed institutions would influence research, education, and cultural understanding for generations to come. Where other families chased innovation, the Mellons focused on endurance. Where others built empires on shifting trends, the Mellons reinforced the pillars that would outlast every cycle the dynasty built to evolve. By the mid-20th century, the Mellon dynasty had done something rare. They transitioned through 3 different economic eras without losing influence, without chasing trends, and without allowing visibility to weaken their position. They had become part of the national structure, woven into the country's banks, its cultural institutions, its industries, and its economic philosophy. And yet the public still knew almost nothing about them. That anonymity was not accidental. It was the result of a design passed down for generations. A design that had protected their empire through wars, depressions, political transitions, and economic revolutions. But the world was about to enter a new phase, one driven by technology, globalization, and the restructuring of American industry, a phase that would challenge even the most resilient dynasties. And once again, the Mellons were preparing quietly. By the late 20th century, the United States was entering a period of profound transition. Technology began reshaping work and communication. Global markets expanded. Industries that once defined American identity started to decline, while new sectors rose quickly and unpredictably. For many old industrial families, this shift was destabilizing. Their empires relied on physical assets, labor-intensive industries, and systems that no longer moved at the pace of the modern world. But the Mellons were different. For more than a century, they had built their dynasty around principles rather than trends. They understood that power is not tied to a single industry, that IT comes from positioning, the quiet ability to adapt while staying anchored in essentials. And so, as America transformed once again, the Mellon family adjusted with the same calm precision that had defined their rise. A changing American economy, traditional industries faced pressure. Steel production declined. Manufacturing moved overseas. Oil markets fluctuated. Banks encountered new regulations and technological competition. But Mellon positions remained resilient because they had never relied on public sentiment or rapid growth. Mellon Bank's conservative approach made it a safe choice in a world of financial experimentation. Gulf Oil's global presence kept it stable even when domestic markets weakened. Alcoa's role in aerospace and modern construction kept it relevant through cycles of change. The family's holdings had evolved into something more than investments. They were structural elements of the American economy. The birth of BNY Mellon, a new kind of financial power. One of the most important transformations in the dynasty's history occurred quietly. With little public attention, Mellon Bank merged with the Bank of New York, an institution older than the United States itself. The result was a financial entity unlike traditional commercial banks. BNY Mellon became a custodian of global assets, managing trillions of dollars for governments, corporations, and wealthy individuals. IT held financial infrastructure rather than chasing consumer markets. IT provided stability rather than speculation. The Mellons no longer needed to compete with modern banks. They had evolved into something deeper, a backbone of the financial system. This was the ultimate expression of the Mellon philosophy. Do not chase the future. Build the foundation the future will rely on. Philanthropy as a strategic tool. During this era, Mellon philanthropy expanded into new areas, not to showcase generosity, but to strengthen influence in fields that shaped public knowledge. Universities received major endowments. Research institutions gained funding that guided scientific priorities. Museums and cultural centers secured Mellon support that lasted generations. Each donation reinforced a long-term presence in American intellectual life. The public. These were acts of generosity. Historians. They were acts of positioning. By supporting culture. The Mellons shaped culture. By supporting education. They influenced education. By supporting research. They guided research. No political campaign or corporate advertisement could match the subtle influence of institutions that carried their name. The public remains unaware by the time these transformations settled into place. The Mellon Dynasty had become a permanent fixture in America's financial and cultural landscape. But unlike the Rockefellers, who appeared in newspapers, or the Carnegies, whose philanthropy was celebrated openly, the Mellons stayed quiet. They avoided magazine covers. They avoided interviews. They avoided the spotlight entirely. Most Americans recognized the Mellon name from museums or university programs, but they did not know the scope of the dynasty behind it. This anonymity was not a coincidence. It was a strength, a shield. The final layer of protection around an empire that had survived for generations. A world preparing to change again. The turn of the century brought new challenges, digital technology, global finance, and the beginning of an interconnected world. Many old dynasties faded. Their industries became outdated, their wealth scattered, their influence dissolved. But the Mellons were already positioned in the one place that would remain essential no matter how the world changed. They held the infrastructure of money itself, the systems, the institutions, the flow of capital, the preservation of wealth. And as the world prepared to enter a new era of financial complexity, the Mellon Dynasty, calm, quiet, and carefully structured, was ready to remain exactly what it had always been, a force beneath the surface of American power. Chapter 5. A New Century: How the Mellon Dynasty Adapted to Globalization and Modern Finance. As the 20th century came to an end, the world entered a new financial era. Markets became digital. Corporations expanded across continents. Money moved faster than governments could track it, and wealth no longer lived in physical assets alone. It lived in information, networks, and the unseen systems that connected global economies. For many old industrial dynasties, this transition was a breaking point. Their businesses were built for a world of factories, rails, and oil fields. A world where power was measured in land, machinery, and physical production. But the Mellons had never tied their identity to any single industry. Their strength came from something deeper: control of capital, control of institutions, and the ability to adapt without losing their foundation. And so, as globalization reshaped the world, the Mellon dynasty adapted with the same calm precision that had guided them through every change before. The evolution of BNY Mellon. The merger of Mellon Bank with the Bank of New York created a financial institution unlike anything the family had controlled in the past. It did not behave like a traditional bank. It did not rely on consumer lending or branches on every street corner. Instead, it became the world's largest custodian of assets, a quiet guardian of wealth for governments, pension funds, corporations, and institutional investors. Trillions of dollars passed through its systems, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily. This new role gave the Mellons something no industrial empire could match: influence over the infrastructure of global finance. Not through publicity, not through dominance, but through necessity. When an institution becomes essential, it cannot be ignored. And BNY Mellon became essential. The decline of old industries and the rise of new influence. Meanwhile, industries that once defined the Mellon empire began to shift. Gulf Oil had merged into global energy corporations, evolving through acquisitions and restructurings. Alcoa faced competition and market volatility, but still held a critical position in aerospace and advanced manufacturing. Real estate holdings continued to appreciate as cities grew and redeveloped, but none of these industries were the center of the dynasty anymore. The real power moved into financial services, fund management, custody, banking, wealth preservation, institutional investment, infrastructure. These were not glamorous fields. They did not produce iconic products or massive public spectacles, but they shaped the global economy more deeply than factories ever could, and they suited the Mellons perfectly. The new generation and the quiet continuation of influence. Younger members of the Mellon family grew up with a different understanding of power. They were not empire builders in the traditional sense. They were custodians, inheritors of a system that had already proven its durability. Their role was not expansion. It was preservation, efficiency, stewardship. They guided foundations, endowments, and private trusts that held vast family wealth. They supported universities and research institutions that carried the Mellon name. They maintained influence in cultural and scientific fields through generations of carefully structured philanthropy. This was not the loud, ambitious rise of earlier eras. It was a calm settling into permanence, the dynasty no longer climbing toward power, but supporting the structures that defined it. The hidden nature of modern Mellon power. By the early 2000s, the Mellon dynasty had accomplished something remarkable. They remained one of the most influential families in the United States, not through companies the public recognized, but through systems the public never sees. Their influence lived in the flow of global capital, the management of institutional wealth, the preservation of cultural institutions, the academic and scientific work shaped by their endowments, the quiet guidance of financial leaders trained in Mellon environments. Most Americans knew the name Mellon from museums, libraries, and foundations. Few understood that the family remained deeply woven into the country's economic structure, and that invisibility, again, was their protection. As the world entered a century defined by rapid change, public attention shifted toward tech billionaires and media personalities. But the Mellons did not need attention. Their power was structural. Their influence was foundational. Their relevance was built into the architecture of global finance. The world was transforming, but the dynasty, as always, was ready. As the 21st century accelerated, The pace of change became overwhelming for many long-established institutions. Technology reshaped everything: how people worked, how companies operated, and how money moved across borders. New fortunes were created overnight. Old industries collapsed just as quickly. But the Mellon Dynasty had never relied on visibility, trend-driven investments, or public dominance. Their power lived in the quiet architecture of finance, in the systems that remained essential no matter how noisy the world became. And so, while the global economy shifted into digital motion, the Mellons adapted without losing the stillness at the center of their strategy. The digital transformation of BNY Mellon. Most banks struggled with the rapid shift toward digital finance. They needed new software, new risk models, new compliance systems, and new ways to move capital around the world. But BNY Mellon was different. Its core function was custody, the safeguarding and movement of assets for institutions. This meant it had already developed one of the most sophisticated financial infrastructures on Earth. As markets digitized, BNY Mellon was not forced to reinvent itself. It only needed to strengthen what already existed. Its technology became the backbone for institutional investing, government funds, pension systems, corporate liquidity, global payment networks. And because trillions of dollars depended on these systems every day, BNY Mellon did not rise or fall with financial trends. It remained a constant, a quiet anchor in a world defined by volatility. For the Mellon family, this was the perfect evolution. Their power no longer depended on commodities or manufacturing. It depended on information, on stability, on trust built over generations. A shift in strategy influenced through continuity. While tech billionaires became cultural icons, the Mellons embraced a different role, one built on reliability rather than disruption. They continued to support universities, museums, scientific research, and public institutions. Their endowments shaped cultural and academic landscapes without ever placing the family in the public eye. This was influence without exposure, presence without attention, control without spectacle. The Mellon name became a quiet signature embedded in the foundations of America's intellectual world. The family withdraws from corporate spotlight over time. The Mellons faded further from the corporate front lines. They no longer served as the visible heads of banks or industrial companies. Their role shifted instead to guiding foundations, trusts, and advisory networks. They became custodians of long-term stability rather than aggressive expansion. They ensured that every major institution carrying the Mellon name remained funded, protected, and strategically aligned. This withdrawal was not a retreat. It was an evolution, a return to the dynasty's deepest principle. The wealth that endures is the wealth that stays unseen. A new kind of wealth. Intellectual capital. As globalization grew more complex, the Mellon family recognized that influence in the modern world was not measured solely in financial terms. It was measured in research, education, cultural preservation, scientific advancement, public policy, institutional governance. And so they focused increasingly on intellectual capital, areas of society that shape how future generations think, work, and understand the world. Their foundations funded innovations in environmental science, data, research, public health, and the humanities. This was not charity. It was strategy. Influence begins with ideas. Ideas shape systems, and systems last longer than fortunes. Endurance over expansion. By the midpoint of the 21st century, the Mellon dynasty had perfected a unique model of modern power. They did not seek growth at any cost. They sought permanence. They ensured that every major asset bearing their name would survive leadership transitions, economic cycles, and cultural shifts. While other dynasties fractured under pressure, the Mellons continued forward steadily, not through dominance, but through design. Their power was quiet, but it was everywhere. Inside financial systems, inside academic institutions, inside cultural frameworks, inside the invisible infrastructure that coordinated the flow of global wealth. They no longer needed to shape industries directly. They shaped the world industries depended on. The Mellon dynasty had entered a stage few families ever reach, a phase where influence becomes structural, where legacy becomes architecture, and where power is no longer built, but inherited through continuity. By the early 21st century, the Mellon dynasty had survived everything a nation could endure: wars, depressions, recessions, political upheavals. technological revolutions, and shifting cultural values. And yet the family remained steady, almost unchanged in its posture. Calm, private, and quietly influential. Their power no longer came from visible empires of oil, aluminum, or heavy industry. It came from something deeper and far more enduring. The systems that managed wealth itself, the institutions that shaped ideas, and the foundations that guided cultural memory. In a world fascinated by loud success stories, the Mellons quietly became one of the few American dynasties whose influence did not fade with time. Instead, it settled into the background of modern life, subtle, steady, and almost unnoticed, influenced through institutions, not individuals. The strength of the Mellon dynasty had never rested on a single personality, not on Thomas, who built the foundation, not on Andrew, who shaped national policy, not on the generations who followed and refined the family structure. The true source of power was institutional, a web of banks, trusts, foundations, research centers, and cultural organizations that carried the Mellon name forward without depending on any one leader. These institutions did more than preserve wealth. They preserved relevance. They ensured that the Mellon presence continued in scientific breakthroughs, art, conservation, economic research, environmental policy, higher education, global finance. Whether or not the public recognized it, Mellon influence quietly guided fields essential to the functioning of a modern society. The quiet persistence of wealth. Economic studies often reveal a surprising fact. The Mellon family, even after more than a century and a half, remains among the wealthiest families in America, not through massive public holdings or celebrity status billionaires, but through diversification and disciplined preservation. Their assets are spread across trusts, private partnerships, institutional investments, endowments, long-term equity positions. This structure protects the family from volatility, lawsuits, media scrutiny, and economic cycles. It is the same structure Thomas Mellon began building during the Civil War, refined through the Depression, and perfected in the modern world. That a design meant not to generate constant growth, but to ensure permanent stability. That a dynasty no longer in the spotlight, and stronger because of it in the modern age. Public dynasties face constant risk. Their wealth is measured openly. Their mistakes become headlines. Their influence is examined, challenged, and criticized. But the Mellons have no such visibility. They remain largely unknown to the general public. Their wealth is quiet. Their institutions do not depend on personality-driven leadership. This invisibility is not accidental. It is the final expression of the Mellon philosophy. Power that is unseen cannot be dismantled. Wealth that is dispersed cannot be targeted. Influence that is structural cannot be erased. Preparing for the next century, the modern world continues to evolve toward artificial intelligence, digital currencies, globalized markets, and new economic vulnerabilities. And yet, the Mellon dynasty remains positioned for whatever comes next. BNY Mellon is central to the global financial system. Mellon-backed institutions guide scientific and cultural progress. Family foundations influence education, research, and environmental policy. Their networks extend through private partnerships few people ever see. The Mellons today are not empire builders. They are custodians, maintaining systems built over generations, protecting structures that shaped the modern world, and ensuring that their dynasty remains relevant even as the country changes around them. A legacy secured through silence. Other financial empires rose faster than the Mellons. Others grew larger. Others became symbols of American capitalism, but almost all of them faded. They fractured under public scrutiny, taxation, mismanagement, scandal, or generational decline. The Mellons did not. They survived because they understood that dynasties are not built through dominance, but through restraint, not through visibility, but through silence, not through spectacle, but through systems. And so, as America moved into the modern age, the Mellon dynasty continued quietly. A family whose influence no longer needed to be proclaimed or defended because it had been woven into the fabric of the country itself. Their story is not one of loud triumphs, but of quiet endurance. The dynasty that outlasted empires, industries, and ideologies, and in doing so, became part of the invisible architecture of American power. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Modern Power. How the Mellon dynasty became interwoven with America's financial core. As the world crossed into the early decades of the 21st century, a new understanding of power began to emerge. Power was no longer defined by ownership of land, factories, or even natural resources. It lived in the systems that moved money, the networks that stored information, and the institutions that governed trust. In this new landscape, most old dynasties struggled to remain relevant. Their wealth was tied to industries that rose and fell with the rhythms of global markets. Their influence depended on visibility, public image, and corporate leadership that often shifted with each generation. But the Mellon Dynasty had a different foundation. Their influence did not depend on personality or publicity. It depended on infrastructure, quiet, essential, irreplaceable. And this is where the family entered one of the most unique phases of its history, a period in which their power became less visible than ever, yet more deeply embedded in the structure of American finance. The transformation of banking into infrastructure. As global finance evolved, banking became more than lending and deposits. It became a system of custody, settlement, asset servicing, and data management. These functions were not glamorous. They were not part of public conversation, but they formed the hidden foundation of the world's financial stability. BNY Mellon emerged as a central pillar of this invisible architecture. It held assets for governments, corporations, pension systems, universities, and sovereign wealth funds. It recorded transactions for global markets. It safeguarded institutional portfolios that shaped national economies. This was not banking as the public understood it. This was financial engineering, a system of quiet, continuous responsibility. And at the heart of that system lived the legacy of a dynasty that had mastered discretion for more than a century. The Mellon identity dissolves into structure. Something unusual happened during this era. The Mellon name gradually disappeared from the headlines, even from corporations once associated with the family. This was not a decline. It was a transition. The dynasty had shifted from owning industries to shaping the systems that industries rely upon. Influence no longer required recognition. It required permanence. Their presence could now be found in trusteeships, endowments, investment committees, cultural and scientific institutions, policy research centers, private foundations. These entities guided decisions slowly and silently, often without the public ever learning who funded their existence or shaped their mission. The Mellons were no longer visible leaders. They were the quiet stewards of continuity. Wealth that moves without being seen. In the modern era, wealth moves quickly. It flows through hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, and global markets. But the Mellon Dynasty did not chase these trends. Instead, they relied on a method perfected over generations. Preserve a diversified centrales. Endure. Their assets existed in forms that did not fluctuate violently with market cycles. Trust shielded wealth from taxation and public scrutiny. Foundations protected capital while advancing long-term influence. Institutional holdings generated stability instead of risk. This allowed the family to maintain quiet resilience even as the world entered periods of economic volatility. Influence through neutrality in a polarized world. Most dynasties attached themselves to political agendas or cultural movements. Some gained visibility. Many lost credibility. Almost all became targets of public criticism. The Mellons avoided this entirely. Their institutions rarely took political positions. Their philanthropy avoided controversy. Their financial operations remained neutral by design. Neutrality became a form of strength because neutrality meant access to all administrations, to all markets, to all sectors of society. And access is one of the purest forms of influence. The dynasty with no central figure by this stage of history. The Mellon Dynasty had evolved into something rare, a powerful family with no singular leader, no public spokesperson, no figurehead who could be criticized or celebrated. Their influence had become distributed across entities that continued functioning regardless of individual presence. In a world obsessed with personalities, the Mellons demonstrated that the strongest systems survive by removing dependence on any one person. This was the ultimate expression of their legacy, a dynasty that moved beyond individuals and became part of the structure of American life itself. The world was still changing. Technologies continued to evolve. Markets became more volatile and more interconnected, but the Mellon Dynasty, as always, adapted quietly. And the next chapter of their story would reveal how a family with no public power maintained relevance in a century defined by public attention. As the world moved deeper into the digital age, legacies that once seemed unbreakable began to fracture. New industries rose with incredible speed. New billionaires appeared and disappeared almost as quickly. Political tensions reshaped national priorities. Public scrutiny intensified around families with visible wealth. But the Mellon Dynasty did not fracture. It did not rise and fall with economic cycles. It did not rely on the charisma of a single heir, or the success of a single company, or the popularity of a single public figure. The Mellons had spent generations preparing for a world where visibility weakened power, and now that preparation protected them. Power without presence. Unlike modern ultra-wealthy families who exist at the center of media attention, the Mellons cultivated a different approach. They avoided celebrity. They avoided political drama. They avoided the public spotlight altogether. Their influence lived behind closed doors, in institutions that managed wealth and ideas, in committees that guided research agendas, and in financial systems that processed the world's capital. This invisibility was not modesty. It was strategy. That a dynasty cannot be dismantled if no one can clearly define where its power begins or ends. The role of private foundations, the Mellon Foundations, became one of the dynasty's most effective instruments of long-term influence. They supported programs in environmental research, economic policy, art, conservation, public education, medical, innovation, scientific discovery. These contributions appeared philanthropic, but they also ensured the family remained embedded in academic networks and cultural institutions that would endure far beyond any single economic cycle. Foundations made the Mellon presence permanent without ever making it visible. Influence across academia. Universities play a central role in shaping how societies think. Through research, policy analysis, and intellectual leadership, the Mellon family understood this earlier than most. Their endowments funded departments, laboratories, grants, scholarships, and institutional expansions. Over time, this created a landscape where Mellon-backed research quietly influenced fields such as economics, environmental science, public policy, history, digital humanities. The public rarely connected these developments to the dynasty, but the effects were profound. A family that once shaped American industry now shaped American understanding. Wealth preserved through structure. The Mellon dynasty's financial holdings were not organized like traditional family fortunes. They were layered across trusts, institutional investment vehicles, charitable endowments, private partnerships, land management groups, specialized asset pools. No single event, economic, political, or personal, could threaten the entire structure. This decentralization made the dynasty resilient. It also made it difficult for outsiders to measure the true scale of Mellon wealth. The public assumed the family had faded. In reality, their wealth had simply become harder to see. A dynasty built for changing times. Many old American families lost relevance as society modernized. Their industries declined. Their influence faded. Their wealth became dispersed across generations. But the Mellons had never tied their identity to the past. Their empire evolved without needing to be reinvented. Their institutions grew without needing to be rebranded. Their wealth endured without needing to be displayed. Instead of chasing new frontiers, they strengthened the foundations that supported them. Financial infrastructure, academic influence, cultural preservation, global capital stewardship. These pillars carried the dynasty into the 21st century, subtle and steady. A family philosophy that never changed from Thomas Mellon to the present day. One principle remained constant: endure quietly. This single idea guided every generation. It kept the dynasty alive through war, depression, globalization, and technological disruption. It protected the family from scandals that destroyed other empires. It allowed the Mellons to operate where attention could not reach them. They did not need to be admired. They did not need to be feared. They did not even need to be known. They needed only to remain. And that is what they did, with a discipline that made them one of the rare American dynasties whose influence did not fade with time. The modern world continued to move faster, louder, and more unpredictably. But the Mellon dynasty stood steady, anchored not in fame or fortune, but in structure. As America moved into an age defined by headlines, social media, and public spectacle, the very nature of power began to shift. Influence was measured in followers, not foundations. Wealth was displayed openly, not preserved quietly. The loudest voices shaped public perception, even when they lacked long-term stability. But the Mellon Dynasty had never relied on public attention. Their power grew in silence. Their wealth expanded through structure. Their influence endured through institutions that outlast individual lifetimes. In this new era, the Mellons did not compete with celebrity billionaires. They did not appear on magazine covers. They did not chase public relevance. They did something far more effective. They remained in the background, calm, constant, and quietly woven into the architecture of American life. Power embedded in systems, not personalities. Most modern fortunes depend heavily on individual figures whose image becomes inseparable from their wealth. When those individuals fall from public favor, their empires weaken. The Mellon Dynasty avoided this vulnerability entirely. Their influence is embedded in universities, banks, financial infrastructure, cultural institutions, scientific organizations, research endowments. These entities do not age. They do not retire. They do not fall out of fashion. They continue quietly, year after year, decade after decade, regardless of who leads them. This structural approach allowed the dynasty to function without a central public figure, which made them almost impossible to challenge or dislodge. A financial role the public never sees. Why Mellon's work rarely appears in news cycles, yet the institution handles an extraordinary amount of the world's assets. Trillions of dollars move through its systems each day: government funds, corporate pensions, investment portfolios, global settlements, institutional transfers. It is not a bank in the traditional sense. It is a stabilizer, a quiet mechanism that keeps financial markets functioning. A vault of information and liquidity. A system so essential that it operates continuously, almost invisibly. This central position ensures that the Mellon legacy remains entwined with the world's financial stability, even though the family name is no longer publicly attached to the institution in the way it once was. The evolution of philanthropic influence. Modern philanthropy often serves as a platform for visibility, a way for wealthy families to shape public narrative. But Mellon philanthropy does the opposite. It avoids attention. It focuses on multi-generation projects that deepen stability rather than public acclaim. Their foundations support scientific innovation, environmental conservation, historical preservation, public education, art restoration, cultural research. These investments are slow and quiet, but they shape the intellectual and cultural landscape of America. Grant by grant, institution by institution, the Mellon presence becomes part of the country's long-term memory. A diversified and protected wealth structure. Many dynasties weaken when wealth fragments across generations. But the Mellons prevented this through strict financial planning and trust structures that centralize decisions and preserve capital. Their wealth is not scattered. It is layered, protected, organized around long-term continuity, not short-term gain. These structures shield the dynasty from public scrutiny, economic volatility, and political change. They also ensure that the family never becomes dependent on a single industry or trend. Influence without exposure. In a world where every public action becomes permanent through digital memory, the Mellons' commitment to invisibility has become a remarkable advantage. There are no scandals linked to them. No political fights, no viral controversies, no media obsession. The very absence of attention protects the dynasty. It shields their institutions. It preserves their influence. It allows them to continue guiding financial and cultural structures without becoming a target of public frustration. This invisibility is not an accident. It is the final stage of a strategy created by Thomas Mellon. Generations ago not seek the spotlight, do not court publicity, do not depend on popularity. Build systems and let the systems speak for you. A dynasty that outlived the age of dynasties. Many once famous American families faded as the world changed. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, even parts of the Rockefeller and Carnegie empires. Their industries became outdated, their wealth dispersed, their influence diluted, their relevance disappeared. But the Mellons survived because they never built a public empire. They built a private framework. A quiet architecture of institutions, trusts, and financial structures that continued long after other dynasties fell. By the time the modern world emerged, the Mellons were no longer competing with other families. They had become something rarer. a dynasty woven into the functioning of the nation itself, not loud, not visible, not celebrated, but permanent. Chapter 7. The Hidden Hand of Policy: How the Mellon Dynasty Shaped America Without Holding Office. As the 21st century unfolded, the relationship between wealth and government became more complex than ever. Corporations influenced legislation. Think tanks shaped public debate. Lobbyists navigated the space between private money and public policy. But while other powerful families relied on political action committees, media appearances, and public influence campaigns, the Mellon dynasty remained faithful to its oldest principle: guide the system quietly. Never become the story. Their power did not come from elected positions. It did not come from public advocacy or political branding. It came from something slower, deeper, and far more enduring: the ability to shape institutions that guided policy long before decisions were made. Influence through intellectual infrastructure. Policy does not begin in Congress. It begins in research papers, in university programs, in long-term studies, in grant-funded projects that influence how leaders think. For decades, Mellon-backed institutions quietly shaped economic theory, environmental policy, public finance, cultural preservation, digital, humanities, scientific research priorities. These were not political interventions. They were intellectual foundations, guiding the knowledge that policymakers relied on. The Mellons shaped decisions without ever appearing in the process. This was the dynasty's invisible advantage: a network built over generations. Unlike modern donors who attach their names to political movements, the Mellons cultivated a wide and stable network of influence across the academic world. Their endowments connected them to major universities, policy research centers, scientific institutes, cultural councils, museum boards, art preservation groups. Through these institutions, Mellon-supported ideas traveled quietly. From research desks to advisory boards to government planning committees to legislative proposals to national policy, it was not direct control. It was continuity. The same form of influence the dynasty had used for more than a century. The advantage of neutrality in a polarized era: almost every wealthy family was pulled into public political battles. Some aligned with one party, others funded ideological movements. Almost all became targets for criticism. But the Mellons maintained neutrality. Their foundations rarely took explicit political positions. Their institutions focused on research and culture, not activism. Their public statements were minimal or non-existent. This neutrality granted them something priceless: access to every side. Because they did not appear as political actors, they remained welcome in administrations across the spectrum. They could speak with policymakers without suspicion. They could influence discussions without being treated as adversaries. Silence became a form of diplomacy. Advisory roles without visibility. Throughout this era, Mellon-connected figures quietly served on advisory panels, economic planning councils, cultural heritage committees, environmental research boards, financial regulation working groups, university governance boards. These positions were not flashy. They did not attract headlines, but they shaped national priorities in subtle ways: guidance on financial regulation, long-term environmental strategies, preservation of cultural institutions, distribution of research grants, standards for economic reporting. Each decision had lasting effects, and each decision was influenced by networks the Mellons helped create. The disappearance of the Mellon name and its strategic purpose. By this point in history, something unusual had happened. The Mellon name appeared less frequently in financial headlines, less frequently in political conversations, and less frequently in public discourse to the casual observer. This might look like decline, but to historians and analysts, it represents the exact opposite. The dynasty had transitioned from visible wealth to embedded influence. Their institutions did not need the Mellon name to maintain power. Their financial networks did not depend on recognition. Their foundations guided thought without attracting attention. The family had achieved the final stage of long-lasting influence, not to be seen, but to be relied upon, preparing for an unpredictable future. As the world moved toward economic uncertainty, technological acceleration, and global instability, many wealthy families struggled to adjust. But the Mellons faced the future with quiet confidence, not because they controlled it, but because they had built a structure designed to endure any scenario. Their holdings were diversified, their institutions were stable, their influence was decentralized, Their philosophy was timeless. The Mellon Dynasty did not need to predict the future. They only needed to remain steady while the world changed around them. They had done it before, and they were ready to do it again. As the 21st century progressed, America's centers of influence became more diffuse. Power no longer rested in a single building, or a single office, or even a single organization. It moved through networks. Quiet connections between institutions that shaped thought, policy, and economic behavior. The Mellon Dynasty understood this shift long before most families did. They realized that the future of influence would not depend on owning industries, but on guiding the institutions that those industries relied upon. And so their strategy expanded beyond wealth preservation. It became a strategy of embedding the Mellon presence into the connective tissue of American intellectual and financial life. Influence through advisory boards and trusteeships. Many of the most important decisions affecting finance, culture, and public policy are made not in legislative chambers, but in advisory meetings and foundation boardrooms. These boards determine research priorities, grant allocations, cultural preservation methods, economic modeling frameworks, environmental program funding, public access to scientific information. Over time, Mellon-affiliated individuals, scholars, and representatives occupied seats in many of these quiet but powerful rooms, not as domineering voices, not as political operatives, but as respected stewards of long-term thinking. Their presence influenced the shape of discussions long before decisions reached the public. The academic network that shapes national understanding. Universities guide how societies think. They create the studies policymakers read. They train the next generation of leaders. They preserve historical memory. The Mellon family has been intertwined with this landscape for decades. Through endowments, scholarship programs, and long-term grants, they supported fields like economic history, environmental science, art, conservation, classical studies, public finance, digital humanities. These investments did not produce immediate returns. They produced understanding, the slow, steady growth of knowledge that influences how a country perceives itself. When policymakers sought evidence, when researchers defined new frameworks, when committees shaped national priorities, they often relied on Mellon-funded work without even realizing its source. Cultural institutions as long-term influence. Museums, libraries, and conservation centers play a quiet role in shaping a nation's identity. They determine what is preserved, what is studied, and what is remembered. The Mellon Dynasty invested heavily in these institutions, not to claim credit, but to ensure continuity in cultural preservation. Their influence can be felt in art restoration programs, digitization of historical archives, public access initiatives, research on cultural heritage, long-term preservation strategies. These projects protect the past, but they also shape how society understands its own narrative. A family that once shaped the steel and energy industries now shaped collective memory. The Mellon approach to modern finance. Even as the global financial system became more complex, the Mellon influence remained anchored through BNY Mellon and its role as a custodian of global capital. Unlike traditional banks that rely on lending or speculation, BNY Mellon performs essential but invisible functions. Securing assets, processing global transactions, managing liquidity for institutions, safeguarding pension funds, servicing government debt instruments. These responsibilities create a form of influence that cannot be easily replicated if manufacturing plants close. New ones can be built if tech companies rise. Others will replace them. But the systems that safeguard trillions of dollars cannot be rebuilt overnight. They require trust, history, and stability, traits the Mellon Dynasty cultivated for generations. That a future shaped by quiet stewardship. By this stage of history, Mellon influence no longer needed to expand. It needed only to continue. Their institutions remained funded, their endowments remained strong, their financial networks remained essential. And because they operated without public attention, they avoided the vulnerabilities that weakened other dynasties. Public scrutiny, political backlash, media controversy, internal fragmentation. Their neutrality protected them. Their invisibility insulated them. Their structure preserved them. The Mellon Dynasty did not dominate the modern world. It supported it, quietly, from beneath the surface, the subtle power of indirect influence. While other families sought the spotlight, the Mellons perfected a different kind of power, one that worked through expertise, stability, and institutional continuity. Their influence was not the loud voice in the room. It was the steady presence at the table, not the figure in the headline, but the foundation beneath the system. This quiet, indirect influence proved more durable than any empire built on fame. The world was entering an era where visibility invited vulnerability, but the Mellons remained invisible, and therefore untouchable. By the modern era, the Mellon Dynasty had become something rare in American history. A family whose influence was not tied to publicity, corporate leadership, or political office, but to the quiet mechanisms that shaped decisions long before they reached the public. Their power no longer needed the Mellon name. It lived in the systems they supported, the institutions they funded, and the networks they sustained over generations. They were not the face of American finance. They were the foundation of it. And this foundation continued to guide outcomes in subtle, almost invisible ways. Influence through expertise, not authority. In today's world, many powerful families attempt to influence public life through bold statements, endorsements, or political sponsorships. But the Mellon Dynasty took a different path, one built on expertise. Experts, not personalities, shaped Mellon influence. Researchers funded by Mellon grants produced papers that shaped economic forecasts. Conservationists supported by Mellon endowments guided federal cultural policy. Scientists funded by Mellon institutions influenced environmental research priorities. University departments anchored by Mellon donations trained policymakers who now hold key positions. None of this required direct intervention. None required public attention. Influence flowed naturally through knowledge, a force far more durable than political alliances. A network that survives generational change. Many dynasties lose power when leadership passes from one generation to the next. Successors may lack discipline. Family wealth may fragment. Institutional control may weaken. But the Mellon Dynasty avoided this cycle by decentralizing leadership. No single family member carried the empire. No individual was essential to the dynasty's survival. Instead, influence rested in trustees, foundation directors, financial stewards, academic partners, institutional leaders. These networks endured regardless of who inherited the family fortune. Even as family members pursued their own lives, the Mellon system continued, steady, familiar, and self-sustaining. It was not built around personalities. It was built around structure. The dissolution of public identity. By this era, the Mellon name had faded so deeply from public awareness that many Americans no longer recognized it at all. To some, this might appear as a disappearance, but to the dynasty, it represented a culmination. Proof that their influence no longer depended on recognition. They had achieved a form of power that did not require acknowledgement, praise, or attention. Their institutions functioned smoothly, without family involvement. Their financial networks continued growing even when their presence was invisible. Their philanthropy shaped culture quietly through long-term grants. This anonymity was not a loss. It was protection. A dynasty cannot be targeted if the public does not perceive it as powerful. The center of financial gravity shifts, and the Mellons remain aligned as technology reshaped global markets. Financial institutions struggled to keep pace, but the Mellon-linked networks within BNY Mellon adapted with uncommon stability. They invested in digital custody services, global asset management infrastructure, advanced financial analytics, institutional risk platforms, data-driven investment frameworks. These developments positioned the organization, and by extension, the dynasty, not as competitors in the new world of finance, but as its infrastructure. They controlled nothing directly, yet supported everything indirectly. This paradox, influence without ownership, became the hallmark of modern Mellon power. The dynasty that outlasts attention cycles. Today's world moves quickly. Stories rise and fall within days. Scandals reshape public perception overnight. Wealth becomes visible, then disappears. But the Mellons remain steady because their influence does not depend on visibility at all. Their power is structural, institutional, distributed, quiet, enduring. They are not vulnerable to public outrage. They are not dependent on innovation cycles. They are not tied to political winds. They are not weakened by generational transitions. They are anchored in the background. A dynasty that does not need to announce its presence because it is woven into the systems that America relies on. A form of power few ever achieve in the end. The Mellon Dynasty accomplished what few families ever manage. They built influence that outlasts reputation. They created institutions that outlive founders. They shaped systems that endure regardless of leadership. They protected wealth through structures the public cannot fully see. They became essential to the functioning of society without being recognized as such. In a world obsessed with visibility, the Mellons mastered invisibility, and invisibility, for them, became the ultimate expression of survival. Chapter 8. The Mellon Philosophy, a blueprint for quiet dynastic survival. As the Mellon Dynasty entered its third century of influence, something remarkable became clear. Their power had not survived by accident, nor through extraordinary luck, nor through a single moment of brilliance. It survived because the family followed a philosophy, a way of thinking passed from one generation to the next, refined quietly over decades, until it became a blueprint for how a dynasty can endure in a world that constantly changes. This philosophy was not loud. It was not aggressive. It did not seek to dominate headlines or control public narratives. It was simple, steady, and deeply strategic. The principle of patience. The Mellons never rushed expansion. They grew slowly, measured risk carefully, and invested in long-term stability rather than short-term success. In a world that rewarded impatience, the Mellons practiced restraint. They avoided speculative booms. They bought when others panicked. They held when others sold. They preserved capital when others overreached. Patience protected them during wars, depressions, and financial crises, times when faster-moving empires collapsed. The discipline of invisibility. While other wealthy families embraced the spotlight as a symbol of success, the Mellons avoided attention. They understood that visibility attracts scrutiny, invites criticism, and creates vulnerability. They chose a quieter path. They let their companies speak for themselves. They let their foundations operate independently. They kept their personal lives private. In the age of modern media, this invisibility became a shield, one that kept the dynasty safe from political anger and public resentment. The power of institutions, not individuals. Many dynasties crumble when leadership changes. A strong founder can build an empire, but successors may not share the same discipline. The Mellons avoided this problem by embedding influence in institutions rather than people. Their power lived in banks, foundations, endowments, universities, research institutes, cultural organizations. These entities continued functioning regardless of who inherited the family fortune. A system lasts longer than a leader, and the Mellons built systems. The structure of preservation. Wealth that remains visible becomes fragile. Wealth that is scattered becomes vulnerable. Wealth that is centralized in personalities becomes unstable. The Mellons protected their fortune through structure, layered trusts, institutional holdings, carefully managed foundations, and diversified assets. This structure allowed the dynasty to remain resilient through every economic era, from industrialization to globalization to digital finance. Influence through continuity, not disruption. Modern billionaires often rise by disrupting industries, transforming technology, challenging old systems, reshaping culture. But disruption creates enemies. It attracts attention. It invites instability. The Mellons built influence the opposite way. They supported continuity. They stabilized institutions. They preserved cultural memory. They funded research that shaped future understanding. Their power did not come from changing systems. It came from supporting the systems that already existed. The art of long-term relevance. Many dynasties fail because they grow too fast, or diversify too broadly, or chase trends that fade. The Mellons avoided all of this. They focused on sectors that would remain essential regardless of economic cycles: finance, infrastructure, education, scientific research, and cultural preservation. When other families shifted direction every decade, the Mellons stayed anchored. This gave them something few dynasties ever achieve: relevance across centuries. The dynasty defined by what it chooses not to do. The Mellon philosophy is defined as much by restraint as by action. They chose not to seek fame. They chose not to dominate politics. They chose not to expand recklessly. They chose not to challenge public opinion. They chose not to make the family name central to their institutions. Every no protected them more than any yes. And through these choices, the Mellons demonstrated that power does not require noise, ambition does not require exposure, and influence does not require control. The philosophy becomes a legacy by this stage of their history, The Mellon Dynasty was no longer simply a wealthy family. They had become a case study, a quiet blueprint for how influence can endure when built on patience, structure, and silence. Their story was not dramatic. IT was not filled with public triumphs or scandals. That IT was not defined by spectacle. It was defined by endurance. That a dynasty that survived because it never demanded recognition. That a dynasty that adapted because it never tied itself to one era. That a dynasty that remained powerful because it understood that true power does not announce itself. That IT simply continues. Every dynasty faces a defining challenge: how to remain relevant when the world around them evolves faster than the structures that built their fortune. For many families, this challenge becomes their downfall. Industries collapse, markets shift, public sentiment changes, successors lose discipline. But the Mellon Dynasty approached adaptation with the same quiet, steady mindset that guided everything they did. They understood that change does not always require reinvention. Sometimes it requires subtle adjustments, careful redirection, and an unwavering commitment to core principles. As America moved into a world driven by technology, data, and globalization, the Mellon Dynasty evolved, not by abandoning their traditions, but by applying them to a new landscape. Adapting without abandoning, the Mellons never tried to compete with emerging tech moguls or media-driven billionaires. They did not attempt to build digital empires or disrupt global markets. Their identity was not tied to innovation or rapid expansion. Instead, they adapted quietly. They shifted resources into financial infrastructure as traditional industries lost influence. They strengthened academic partnerships as knowledge became the new currency. They expanded cultural support as society became more fragmented. They modernized their institutions without changing their mission. This subtle evolution allowed the dynasty to bridge two worlds: the world of their ancestors and the world of the modern age. A philosophy that transcends industries. Thomas Mellon built his early fortune in banking and real estate. Andrew expanded it through steel, oil, and aluminum. Later generations shifted it toward finance and philanthropy. Yet through all these transitions, the underlying philosophy remained constant: avoid speculation, avoid exposure, avoid dependency, focus on permanence. This is why the family's influence did not weaken when industrial empires declined. Their identity was never tied to a single company or sector. It was tied to a mindset, a way of structuring wealth and influence that could survive any era. Adapting to a world of information as technology transformed society, much of the world became dependent on digital systems with complex vulnerabilities and rapid life cycles. But the Mellons focused on areas that remained constant: academic research, financial systems, cultural institutions, environmental science, public archives, long-term endowments. These pillars hold value whether the world is analog or digital. They are immune to trends, immune to technological obsolescence, and immune to market cycles. By anchoring themselves in essential fields, the Mellons preserved influence in a world defined by change. Leadership through stewardship, not control. Many modern dynasties try to maintain relevance by producing a public-facing leader, a central figure who becomes the face of the family. The Mellons avoided this entirely. Their leadership was steward-based, not personality-based. They empowered trustees rather than heirs, committees rather than individuals, institutions rather than families. This allowed the dynasty to adapt without the risk of internal conflict and without the volatility that accompanies charismatic but unpredictable successors. When leaders stepped down, the system continued. When generations changed, the mission remained. When society shifted, the institutions endured. Adapting through decentralization. As the modern world became more interconnected, many families centralized power to maintain control. The Mellons did the opposite. They decentralized. Their wealth became distributed across trusts that operated independently, foundations governed by professionals, institutions with long-standing charters, financial systems guided by regulation and tradition. Decentralization made the dynasty flexible. It allowed different branches of the family to pursue their own lives without risking the integrity of the whole. It also removed a single point of failure, a critical factor in long-term dynastic survival. The quiet adaptability behind the scenes. Throughout the early 21st century, Mellon institutions modernized their operations in subtle ways. Financial entities integrated new regulatory frameworks without destabilizing their structure. Cultural institutions digitized archives without losing traditional stewardship. Academic programs shifted toward new fields of study without sacrificing depth. This quiet adaptation allowed the dynasty to remain relevant without ever appearing to chase modernity. They did not react to trends. They prepared for longevity that a dynasty defined by evolution, not reinvention. By this stage in their history, the Mellons had reached a rare equilibrium, a balance between continuity and change that allowed them to maintain relevance without compromising identity. They did not reinvent themselves in dramatic ways. They evolved slowly, steadily, and intentionally. They survived because they knew what to protect. They thrived because they knew what to let go. They endured because they understood that adaptation is not about mastering the future, but about remaining grounded while the world accelerates around you. This adaptability became one of their greatest strengths, a quiet force guiding the dynasty into yet another era. As the Mellon Dynasty advanced further into the modern era, one truth became unmistakable. Their greatest strength was not their wealth, their institutions, or even their influence. It was their silence, that a quiet presence that shielded them from public scrutiny, that a quiet discipline that kept the family focused on continuity, that a quiet strategy that allowed their dynasty to survive where so many others dissolved. In a world defined by noise and spectacle, the Mellons mastered the opposite, the ability to endure by staying unseen. The power of avoiding attention. Modern society rewards visibility. Public figures build brands. Corporations promote personalities. Families with wealth often become cultural symbols. But visibility brings vulnerability. It invites criticism. It amplifies mistakes. It exposes internal conflicts. It creates narratives the family cannot control. The Mellons understood this long before the age of social media. They protected themselves from public attention not by retreating, but by designing their empire so it never required a visible leader. Their influence flowed through institutions, not individuals, through systems, not speeches. Silence became their strongest form of protection. Stability through predictable action. The Mellon Dynasty did not rise through unpredictable moves or bold leaps. Their strategy was built on predictability. Slow expansion, low visibility, minimal risk, long-term planning, institutional continuity in times of crisis. This consistency inspired trust. In times of prosperity, it prevented overreach. When markets panicked, the Mellons remained steady. This stability became a language of its own, a signal to partners, policymakers, and institutions that the Mellon presence represented reliability in a world filled with instability. Wealth that does not depend on emotion. Many modern fortunes rise through industries shaped by public sentiment, technology, entertainment, consumer trends. When cultural preferences change, these fortunes become fragile, but the Mellons built their wealth around functions that society cannot abandon. Asset custody, institutional finance, research, infrastructure, cultural preservation, education, public archives. These pillars do not fluctuate with fashion. They do not collapse when trends fade. They remain essential across generations. This gave the Mellon Dynasty something rare: wealth insulated from public emotion. Influence that works indirectly. Direct power is loud. It demands action, attention, and constant reinforcement. Indirect power is quieter. It shapes how others think before they realize they have been shaped. The Mellon Dynasty specializes in indirect influence. Endowments that guide academic research, foundations that shape cultural preservation, financial institutions that manage global liquidity, trusteeships that guide public institution, scholarships that educate future decision-makers. Each influence is subtle on its own. Together, they form a network of quiet authority that does not need public acknowledgement to be effective. A dynasty protected from its own success. Many families collapse under the weight of the wealth they built. Money creates internal conflict. Ambition divides the next generation. Inconsistency leads to scandal or decline. The Mellons prevented this through decentralized trusts, professional management, clear governance structures, institutional oversight, philanthropic integration. These systems removed pressure from individual heirs. They prevented the family from becoming dependent on a single successor. They protected the dynasty from internal fragmentation. Success did not weaken them, because success was not held by individuals. It was held by structures. silence as a long-term investment, the Mellon Dynasty's quiet approach offered one final advantage. They avoided the cycles of public backlash that destroyed other wealthy families. Public opinion shifts, political winds shift, cultural values shift. But the Mellons remained outside these cycles. They did not enter public debates. They did not position themselves as cultural authorities. They did not attach their name to controversy. And because they remained neutral, they remained enduring that a dynasty defined by what remains as the modern world continued to evolve. The Mellons proved that the strongest dynasties are not always the loudest. They are the ones that understand the value of silence. They are the ones that survive by stepping aside while others seek attention. They are the ones that allow their structures to speak for them. Their legacy is not dramatic. It is not flamboyant. It is not widely known. It is something quieter. A long, steady presence embedded in the systems that hold America together. The Mellon Dynasty's true inheritance is not money or influence or institutions. It is endurance, the ability to remain, to adapt, and to guide from the background long after louder voices have faded. Chapter 9. A Dynasty Beyond Wealth. How the Mellons influenced America's identity without the nation realizing it. As the Mellon story moved deeper into the 21st century, something subtle became clear. Their influence could not be measured only in dollars, companies, or institutions. It lived in something much harder to see: the cultural identity of the nation itself. Unlike other dynasties that shaped industry or technology, the Mellons shaped memory. They shaped knowledge. They shaped the way America understood its own history, its environment, its art, and even its economic principles. Their fingerprints were not on headlines, but on the frameworks behind them, not on public speeches, but on the ideas that guided public life. This influence worked slowly, quietly, and with remarkable endurance. The Mellon imprint on American culture. Many Americans wander through museums, libraries, or gardens without realizing they are walking through spaces shaped by Mellon philanthropy. Art preserved through Mellon-funded restoration programs. Historical documents safeguarded by Mellon grants. Architectural heritage maintained by Mellon-backed conservation. Public gardens and cultural centers supported by Mellon endowments. These contributions may appear decorative, but they create a nation's cultural memory, its understanding of who it is and where it came from. Through these institutions, the Mellon Dynasty shaped America's identity without ever needing to claim credit. Custodians of knowledge. Knowledge is one of the most powerful tools in society. It shapes policy. It guides education. It influences public perception. The Mellon family understood this deeply. Their endowments supported research in fields that seldom attract private funding. Archaeology, digital humanities, rare manuscript preservation, scientific research, infrastructures, environmental and ecological studies. These areas do not create instant fame or profit, but they create long-term understanding that a country guided by informed decision-makers remains stable. And stability is the soil in which dynasties grow. Mellon influence in the modern economy. Economic theories taught in universities often rely on research funded by Mellon institutions. Historical models of financial cycles reference Mellon-supported archives. Analyses of public debt, taxes, and economic trends often cite Mellon-endowed research centers. This does not mean the family dictates policy, but their legacy shapes the education of the people who eventually create policy. This is not power through controlled. It is power through foundation, quiet and enduring. How the Mellons shaped environmental awareness in a world facing climate change and environmental uncertainty. The Mellon Dynasty quietly expanded influence into ecological science. They funded climate research, technology, biodiversity studies, land stewardship programs, environmental humanities, long-term sustainability projects. These grants helped shape national and academic conversations about conservation and environmental responsibility. The Mellon name rarely appears in public debates, but their support shapes the data and research that those debates rely on. A legacy that does not seek recognition. Unlike dynasties that build monuments to themselves, the Mellon Dynasty allowed their influence to blend into the institutions they supported. Most visitors do not notice the small plaques. Most researchers do not track the origins of their grants. Most policymakers do not realize how many of their ideas were shaped indirectly by Mellon-funded studies. And that is exactly how the dynasty prefers it: influence without Recognition lasts longer than influence built on fame. The quiet shaping of American values through generations of cultural, academic, and financial support. The Mellons influenced how America preserves its past, how America studies its present, how America imagines its future. Their impact is not loud, but it is foundational. They strengthened public institutions at a time when many were losing support. They preserved neutral spaces for research in a world increasingly polarized. They kept cultural memory alive even as society changed at unprecedented speed. This is influence at its most subtle, a dynasty shaping not the direction of the nation, but the depth of the nation. The unseen guardians of continuity. Every society relies on quiet custodians, figures or families who ensure that knowledge, art, science, and history do not vanish between generations. For America, the Mellon Dynasty became one of these custodians. They protected archives others ignored. They preserved heritage others overlooked. They funded innovations others considered too uncertain. They strengthened institutions others allowed to decline. Their role was not heroic, but it was essential. They did not shape the visible surface of America. They shaped the layers beneath it, layers that keep the country steady as it moves through cycles of chaos, prosperity, change, and uncertainty. That a dynasty does not endure because it is powerful, that it endures because it becomes part of the structure that society relies upon. As the world continued shifting through economic cycles and cultural transformation, the Mellon Dynasty remained steady, not because they resisted change, but because they understood where change begins and how to position themselves within it. Their influence was not loud, not visible, not centered in a single arena. It was woven carefully into the fabric of institutions that guide modern life from behind the scenes. Universities, museums, research foundations, financial infrastructures, environmental centers, public archives. These places do not sit in the spotlight. They sit at the roots of society, quietly shaping the branches above them. And it was within these roots that the Mellon Dynasty positioned itself for long-term endurance. Influenced through modern financial stability, the global financial system has become increasingly complex, faster, more interconnected, and more dependent on institutions that few people ever see. BNY Mellon plays a central role in this ecosystem. It safeguards assets for nations, manages liquidity for corporations, and ensures the stability of financial markets during periods of uncertainty. Most people never think about the systems that allow pensions to be paid, or government bonds to clear, or investment funds to move across borders. But these systems rely on organizations like BNY Mellon, structures that emerged from the dynasty's evolution. This quiet position gives the family a form of influence that does not rise or fall with public sentiment. It is structural, enduring, and deeply embedded. A presence in the digital knowledge age information became the center of modern life. The Mellons ensured their institutions evolved with it, their endowments funded digital archivist data-driven research, advanced humanities programs, modern conservation technologies, new methods of academic collaboration. These investments allowed traditional fields to adapt to the digital world without losing their essence, by supporting the transition from analog to digital knowledge. The Mellon Dynasty helped shape the way future generations will access history, art, science, and cultural memory. This is not influence measured in headlines, but in preservation. The Mellon role in environmental future building. As climate change became one of the central challenges of modern life, the dynasty expanded its presence in environmental research. Through grants and endowments, they supported ecosystem monitoring, conservation science, renewable resource studies, climate-focused humanities, land stewardship initiatives. These projects guided policymakers, informed public understanding, and strengthened institutions dedicated to environmental resilience. The Mellon Dynasty did not enter the climate debate as activists or opponents. They entered as quiet supporters of understanding, a position that avoids conflict while shaping outcomes long-term. Cultural institutions entering the modern era, museums, libraries, and archives faced financial pressure in the digital age. Visitors declined, budgets shrank, collections required expensive preservation. Through Mellon philanthropy, many of these institutions received lifelines, not just funding, but strategic support that allowed them to expand digitally, build new programs, and reach audiences around the world. Artworks were restored, manuscripts digitized, exhibitions expanded, public access improved, without drawing attention to themselves. The Mellons ensured that cultural memory remained intact in an era when it could have fractured influence. Through neutrality, one of the most powerful aspects of modern Mellon influence is that it remains free from political identity. While many families tied their fortunes to specific agendas, the Mellons preserve neutrality across all sectors. This neutrality allows their institutions to function regardless of political climate or cultural trends. Governments change, parties shift, policies evolve. But academic labs continue research, museums continue preservation, financial institutions continue stabilizing markets. Environmental centers continue monitoring ecosystems. The Mellon Dynasty's impact does not depend on who wins an election or how public opinion fluctuates. That IT continues because it is anchored in systems that society needs no matter what changes above them, that a legacy hidden in plain sight by this stage in their history. The Mellons had become one of the few American dynasties whose modern influence was not tied to fame but to structure. Their presence is felt in classrooms, in scientific journals, in cultural spaces, in preserved landscapes, and in the financial systems that move billions every day. Most people will never know how deeply Mellon support shaped the institutions they rely on, and that is the design. The dynasty's power is not built on recognition. It is built on endurance, subtle, steady, and embedded. By the modern era, the Mellon dynasty had accomplished something almost no other American family achieved. They moved beyond influence tied to wealth, beyond influence tied to industry, and even beyond influence tied to identity. They became part of the country's underlying structure, so deeply integrated into the systems that support finance, culture, science, and education that their presence no longer felt external. It felt structural, that a quiet architecture of continuity that remained steady even as the world shifted around it. The unseen pillars of American finance. Most Americans never interact with BNY Mellon directly. They do not open accounts there, take out loans, or see advertisements for its services. But behind the scenes, BNY Mellon handles the most sensitive and essential functions of modern finance. Safeguarding assets, managing institutional portfolios, ensuring liquidity, processing global transactions, supporting government debt operations, maintaining financial records used across the world. If these systems stopped functioning, markets would freeze, governments would struggle to operate, corporations would halt expansion, pension funds would lose stability. This quiet backbone of the global financial system traces its lineage directly to the Mellon dynasty. IT is not public. IT is not glamorous, but it is indispensable. The kind of influence that outlives eras. The invisible hand of cultural memory. Walk through a museum, visit a library, or explore a preserved historical site, and you will feel Mellon influence even if you never see the name. Their funding helped conserve centuries-old manuscripts, historic architecture, artworks, fragile cultural artifacts, National Archives, scientific collections. These contributions do more than preserve beauty. They preserve identity. That a nation cannot understand itself without tending to its past. The Mellons helped ensure that America's story would not fade in an era dominated by rapid change and disposable information. That a dynasty that strengthens knowledge inside universities, research labs, and academic departments. The Mellon presence continues to guide the intellectual foundations of the country. They help train future leaders, shape academic fields, and support the research that influences public policy. Their contributions influence environmental science, economic theory, digital humanities, public archives, cultural studies, global history. These are not trends. They are the pillars that hold a society together, the disciplines that define how a nation thinks. By investing in knowledge rather than influence, the Mellons shaped the minds that eventually shaped the country. Influence without intention to control. Unlike families that sought political dominance, the Mellons did not attempt to steer national policy directly. Their goal was not to control the country's direction, but to strengthen its foundations. And in strengthening those foundations, they created a form of influence much deeper than political power. Politicians change, ideologies shift, public attention wanders, but the institutions that guide culture, finance, and science remain steady. These are the arenas where the Mellon Dynasty found permanence, that a legacy built to outlast public memory. The most extraordinary aspect of the Mellon story is how easily the public forgets the family behind so many of these institutions. While many dynasties work tirelessly to preserve their names, the Mellons allowed their name to fade so their influence could last. Because names depend on recognition, structures depend on function, and function survives longer than fame. Today, the Mellon Dynasty continues not as a visible force, but as a quiet framework. The foundations of museums, the endowments of universities, the lifelines of research labs, the architecture of financial markets, the guardianship of cultural heritage, the preservation of national knowledge. This is influence without spectacle, power without ambition, and legacy without self-promotion. A dynasty absorbed into the country it shaped. In the end, the Mellon family did not just build a fortune. They built a structure so lasting that it became part of the nation itself. Their influence is not something Americans see. It is something Americans depend on. In their financial systems, their cultural memory, their scientific research, and their intellectual life, the Mellons did not need to be remembered in order to remain relevant. Their legacy lives in the systems that keep the country steady. A dynasty that began with a single immigrant's determination became an invisible pillar beneath American civilization. Not loud, not celebrated, not widely known, but permanent. Chapter 10. The Final Transformation. How the Mellon Dynasty became a blueprint for quiet power in the 21st century. As America stepped fully into the 21st century, a new kind of influential figure dominated the global stage. Tech founders, media personalities, billionaires with massive platforms, and public empires built on visibility. Their power was loud, spectacular, and deeply dependent on constant attention. Against this backdrop, the Mellon Dynasty looked almost out of place. A family with no public-facing CEO, no aggressive modern empire, no desire for recognition. And yet, while the world focused on the rise of new fortunes, the Mellons quietly achieved something far more lasting. They transformed themselves into a model, not for wealth creation, but for wealth endurance, not for public influence, but for invisible structural power. Their story became a blueprint for how a dynasty can survive centuries in a country defined by volatility. The shift from fortune to framework. Many families rise through extraordinary economic success. But the challenge is not building wealth, it's keeping it. The Mellons mastered this challenge by shifting their identity. From industrialisto financiers, from financiersto institutional stewards, from stewardsto cultural and academic architects, this transformation allowed the dynasty to remain relevant even as America changed beyond recognition. They did not cling to old industries. They evolved into systems that would outlast them. The endurance of institutional influence. The Mellon Dynasty's modern power does not come from companies with their name attached. It comes from institutions the country depends on. Universities, museums, scientific foundations, financial custodians, research archives, environmental organizations. These institutions shape national thought and stability. They guide understanding, inform decisions, and preserve heritage. Most dynasties tie influence to a person or a corporation. The Mellons tied theirs to structures. Structures cannot die. Structures do not lose popularity. Structures do not collapse from personal scandal. This is why the dynasty endures. The quiet hand behind financial stability. BNY Mellon, the institution that carries the last remnants of the family's financial identity, continues to act as a backbone of the global economy that safeguards assets, manages liquidity, processes international flows of capital, supports governments and pension systems, anchors financial markets during crises. This is not dramatic power. It is not headline-making power. It is foundational power, the kind that becomes more essential the less visible it is. The Mellon method becomes a model as modern billionaires face scrutiny, tax battles, public pressure, and the volatility of fame. Experts often look to the Mellons as a case study in quiet endurance. Their method has been studied in business schools, economic history departments, philanthropic strategy, circles, family wealth management seminars. What they built was not simply a fortune. It was a philosophy. A roadmap for how to preserve influence without being consumed by it. A dynasty grounded in restraint. The Mellons succeeded not through expansion, but through restraint, not through dominance, but through stability, not through visibility, but through silence. Their greatest asset became their ability to avoid the weaknesses that destroy most dynasties. Public visibility, political entanglement, centralized leadership, rapid expansion, generational fragmentation. By sidestepping these traps, they created a form of power that operates in the background, rarely acknowledged, yet deeply embedded. Their relevance today, even now, long after their names faded from public consciousness, the Mellon presence remains everywhere. In the archives scholars rely on, in the museums that preserve cultural memory, in the financial systems that stabilize global markets, in the universities shaping future leaders, in environmental sciences guiding conservation, and research foundations pushing knowledge forward. Their influence is no longer tied to them. It is tied to the country itself. That is the final transformation, a dynasty that no longer needs to be seen to remain essential. The story enters its final stage by this point in the narrative. The Mellon Dynasty has become something no wealth-driven family expects to become: timeless. Not because they conquered markets, not because they dominated politics, but because they understood something deeper. To endure, power must become quiet. To survive, wealth must become structure. To remain, a dynasty must dissolve into the institutions it strengthens. The Mellons did not remain influential despite their invisibility. They remained influential because of it. They became part of the hidden architecture of American life, a dynasty that shaped the country not through force, but through foundation. As America moved deeper into the age of digital power and global interconnection, a remarkable truth emerged about the Mellon Dynasty. Their legacy no longer depended on the family at all. It lived in the institutions they built. It lived in the systems they supported. It lived in the cultural and intellectual foundations they strengthened. Many dynasties fade when the founding generation passes. Others dissolve slowly as successors lose discipline or unity. Some collapse under the pressure of fame or political entanglement. But the Mellons evolved into something different, a dynasty that no longer needs a family presence to maintain influence. Their legacy became self-sustaining, a structure carried forward by institutions designed to endure long after individuals were gone. Influence becomes independent of the family in the modern era. A visitor walking into a Mellon-funded museum may never see the family name. A student receiving a Mellon scholarship may never know its origin. A researcher using Mellon-backed funding may never learn why that program exists. This anonymity reflects a unique stage of dynastic evolution. The dynasty has become larger than the people who created it. Their institutions operate on missions that no longer depend on active family leadership. Their financial systems stabilize markets regardless of the family's involvement. Their cultural and academic contributions continue shaping society quietly and consistently. The Mellons did not build monuments to themselves. They built frameworks that function without them. A legacy embedded in learning. Universities that received Mellon support now offer programs that outlast generational shifts. Research fields strengthened by Mellon grants continue to influence global understanding. Scholars whose work depends on Mellon endowments shape public policy, scientific progress, and cultural preservation. This is influenced through continuity, a dynasty guiding society through the knowledge it protects. The Mellons did not seek to shape leaders directly. They shape the environments in which leaders are formed. A cultural impact that deepens over time. Museums and archives supported by Mellon institutions do not simply preserve artifacts. They preserve identity. They protect humanity's past so future generations can understand their place in the world. Each restored painting, each conserved manuscript, each digitized collection represents a small piece of the Mellon legacy, a legacy that works quietly but meaningfully. Their influence grows not through expansion, but through preservation. A financial footprint that stabilizes global markets. Billionaire Mellon, though no longer a family-run entity, continues to operate on principles rooted in Mellon conservatism, discipline, reliability, and long-term thinking. It safeguards pension funds, government reserves, corporate assets, sovereign wealth, global investment portfolios. This stabilizing function affects millions of people who will never know the Mellon name. Their philosophy lives inside an institution that keeps global finance moving during crises that can shake entire nations. When markets panic, structures built on Mellon foundations continue operating with calm precision. The dynasty that disappears to survive. At this stage in the story, the Mellon Dynasty has achieved something exceedingly rare. They have faded from public view while their influence remains intact. This disappearance is not a sign of decline. It is a final act of protection. Most dynasties lose their power because they become symbols of power. Symbols attract criticism, resentment, political attacks, and public fascination. The Mellons avoided becoming symbols. They allowed their institutions to speak for them. They allowed their structures to survive independently. They allowed themselves to blend into the fabric of the nation. And because they disappeared, their legacy endured. A lasting blueprint for future dynasties. Family offices, wealth managers, and historians often study the Mellon model as a guide for long-term dynastic success. It teaches that wealth must be protected through structure. Influence must be indirect. Visibility must be minimized. Institutions must outlast individuals. Neutrality is more powerful than advocacy. Preservation is more stable than expansion. These lessons are simple, but they are difficult to execute and nearly impossible to sustain across multiple generations. The Mellons accomplished it through discipline inherited across a century and a half. A future shaped by their silence. The modern world is louder than ever, but the foundations built by the Mellons continue to stabilize the country quietly. They do not need new heirs to step into the spotlight. They do not need to reclaim public presence. They do not need to assert their legacy. The institutions they created carry it for them. Their influence lives in stability, in knowledge, in culture, in preserved history, in financial systems that keep the world functioning. Their silence is not absence. It is presence. A presence woven into the background of American life. As the Mellon story reaches its final chapter, one truth rises above all others. The dynasty did not endure because it stayed powerful. It endured because it became part of the foundation of American life. Their influence no longer depends on family members, corporate control, or public identity. It exists in the systems that shape the nation, quiet, steady, and often unnoticed. This is the rarest kind of legacy. A legacy not attached to a name, but to a structure. Influence that becomes infrastructure. Most dynasties leave behind stories. Some leave behind companies. A few leave behind cultural institutions. But the Mellons left something deeper. A financial backbone, a cultural memory framework, an academic ecosystem, an environmental research network, a preserved national heritage. These structures do not fade when families fade. They do not collapse when individuals pass. They do not weaken when eras change. They persist. They operate. They evolve. They stabilize. The Mellon Dynasty created influence that functions even when no one remembers its origin. A dynasty absorbed into the nation's identity. The Mellons became so deeply embedded in American systems that their legacy can now be felt more easily than it can be recognized. This is the quiet paradox of their influence. You see their work everywhere you look, but you rarely see them. Their institutions restored America's art, cataloged its archives, stewarded its parks, shaped its universities, and supported its scientific research. Their financial legacy safeguards assets that affect millions of lives, from retirements to government reserves. Their structures hold part of the nation together, even when no one knows the dynasty behind them. The final transformation, from dynasty to framework at the end of the Mellon story. The family has completed a transformation few achieve. They shifted from wealth to stewardship, from visibility to invisibility, from influence to architecture. Their power no longer needs their presence. It lives in the institutions that follow their philosophy. Discretion, stability, endurance, neutrality, structural thinking. This transformation ensures their story continues even without direct continuation from the family itself. What the Mellons teach about lasting power. Their journey reveals a different understanding of influence. True dynasties do not rise by dominating the moment. They rise by outlasting it. True power is not the ability to control the present. It is the ability to shape the future quietly through systems that endure beyond public memory. True legacy is not a monument with a name. It is a foundation no one questions because it feels permanent. The Mellon Dynasty embodied these principles so consistently that their legacy no longer feels like a family achievement, but a national inheritance. A future built on their quiet design as America moves into new eras of uncertainty, economic instability, technological disruption, ecological change. The structures the Mellons helped build continue operating with calm reliability. Financial markets rely on the systems they shaped. Universities rely on the research they funded. Museums rely on the preservation methods they supported. Scientists rely on the grants their foundations established. Even as the world becomes louder, the Mellon legacy grows quieter, deeper, and more embedded, the dynasty that survives by disappearing in the end. The Mellons survived longer than louder dynasties because they stepped out of the spotlight and into the background. They became caretakers instead of conquerors, architects instead of rulers, custodians instead of celebrities, and by doing so, they created a form of influence that modern wealth rarely achieves, a legacy that cannot be undone because it no longer belongs to them alone. It belongs to the country they helped shape. The Mellon Dynasty may no longer stand at the center of American power, but their quiet presence remains everywhere, in the systems, institutions, and ideas that keep the nation moving forward. Their story does not end. It simply becomes part of the foundation, that a dynasty hidden in plain sight, that a legacy that endures through structure, that a quiet force beneath American life. And so, as we reach the end of this story, we step back from the names, the institutions, and the eras, and we see the Mellon Dynasty for what it truly became. Not a family of industrial giants, not a fortune built on spectacle, but a quiet thread woven through the very structure of American life. Their influence does not echo loudly through history. It hums softly beneath it, in the archives that preserve our past, in the museums that protect our culture, in the research that guides our future, and in the financial systems that keep the world steady even in times of fear and uncertainty. Most people will never know how deeply this dynasty shaped the country, and perhaps that is exactly why they endured. They chose silence over recognition, structure over fame, and continuity over power. The Mellons remind us that some of the most powerful forces in history are the ones we never see. For generations, they stood in the background, quiet, patient, and unwavering, while the world rose, fell, and changed around them. And even now, long after their name faded from public memory, the imprint of their presence remains. If you're still awake, thank you for sharing this time with me. If you've drifted off, I hope this story carried you gently into rest. Before you go, let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these calm, cinematic documentaries, make sure you subscribe to Money Vault so you never miss a new story. Good night, and until next time, sleep well.